Tonight, I find myself remembering the vast emptiness of ancient desert routes, the way morning mist would cling to camel bells, and how the rhythm of hoofbeats against sand shaped the very foundations of human survival. This is history as it was lived and hurried, unpolished, real. If this quiet approach to the past helps you unwind, a like would mean a lot. Subscribe if you'd like to join me for more slow journeys through history. Tell me in the comments where tonight finds you listening. What draws you to these ancient stories of accidental discovery? Dim the lights. Let's drift back to a time when hunger and chance conspired to change everything. I remember the weight of that leather pouch made from a young sheep's stomach, warm against the merchant's side as he prepared for the long journey ahead. The milk inside fresh that morning from his small herds, loshed gently with each step his camel took across the endless dunes. He had no way of knowing that the very container he'd chosen would transform his simple provision into something entirely new. The desert heat pressed down like a living thing, relentless and inescapable. Hour after hour, the sun beat against the leather pouch, warming the milk inside to temperatures that would have spoiled it under normal circumstances. But this was no ordinary container. The stomach lining contained something invisible to ancient eyes, a natural enzyme that would soon work its quiet magic. As the hours passed and the camel's steady gait provided constant, gentle agitation, the milk began to change. The proteins clumped together, forming solid masses that the merchant would later call curds. The remaining liquid was separated from these new formations, leaving behind something that had never existed before in human experience: cheese. When evening finally came and the merchant stopped to make camp, he discovered his transformation. The milk he had packed that morning was gone, replaced by solid white chunks floating in a clear, slightly salty liquid. The whey quenched his desert thirst more effectively than water ever could, and those strange, solid pieces, they were rich, satisfying, and somehow still fresh despite the brutal heat that should have ruined any dairy product hours ago. This is the story we tell ourselves about cheese, the legend of accidental discovery that feels almost too perfect to be true. And perhaps it is merely legend, but the truth behind it runs deeper than any single moment of discovery. The truth is written in microscopic traces of fat preserved in 7,000-year-old pottery, in the administrative records of ancient Sumerian scribes, in tomb murals painted by Egyptian artists who watched the process unfold in real life. The merchant's story, whether it happened exactly as we imagine or not, captures something essential about humanity's relationship with food, with survival, with the beautiful accidents that sometimes save us from ourselves. Because cheese was not just another food, it was our first preservation miracle, our earliest victory over time itself. I remember how this discovery must have spread slowly and quietly from one settlement to the next, not through grand announcements or royal decrees, but in the patient way that truly important knowledge travels from mother to daughter, from shepherd to shepherd, from one small community to another. The technique was simple enough. Take milk, add something that would make it curdle, separate the solids from the liquid, and wait. But the implications were staggering. For the first time in human history, the nutritional wealth of milk could be preserved for weeks, even months. Proteins and fats that would spoil within days in their original form could now sustain communities through long winters, failed harvests, and dangerous journeys. The seasonal abundance of spring, when animals produced the most milk, could be stored and rationed throughout the year. But cheese became something more than mere sustenance. It became currency in ancient Mesopotamia, where Sumerian accountants carefully recorded cheese allotments in their cuneiform tablets. It became a marker of social status in ancient Egypt, where wheels of cheese were buried alongside pharaohs and nobles to sustain them in the afterlife. It became both divine gift and savage necessity in Greek mythology, embodying the eternal tension between civilization and wildness that would follow cheese throughout its long history. The Romans transformed it into an industrial product, feeding their vast armies on standardized wheels of pecorino romano that could survive months-long military campaigns. Medieval monks elevated it into an art form, experimenting with bacterial cultures and aging techniques in their patient, methodical way. The modern world fractured it into two competing philosophies: mass production versus artisanal craft, safety versus flavor, efficiency versus soul. Tonight, as we begin this journey together, I want you to imagine cheese not as the familiar commodity we know today, but as it must have seemed to those first discoverers. Picture the wonder of a Neolithic farmer in Poland 7,500 years ago, as she poured fresh milk through one of those mysterious perforated bowls and watched the curds collect in the bottom. Feel the reverence of an Egyptian cheesemaker painting the process on a tomb wall, knowing that this image would guide the departed through eternity. Sense the quiet pride of a Roman soldier as he shared his daily cheese ration around a campfire in some distant province, carrying the taste of home to the edges of the known world. The story I want to tell you is not just about cheese. It's about humanity's endless capacity to transform accident into art, necessity into culture, survival into something approaching beauty. It's about how we take the simplest things, milk, time, patience, and turn them into expressions of place, tradition, and identity that can endure for thousands of years. So settle in, let the familiar world fade around the edges, and join me as we trace this ancient thread from its mysterious beginnings to the complex, sometimes contentious world of cheese today. We'll visit Polish villages where the first evidence lies buried in archaeological layers. We'll walk through Egyptian tombs where cheese was deemed worthy of the afterlife. We'll stand in Roman military camps where standardized rations fed an empire. We'll enter monastery cellars where monks perfected techniques that survived the fall of civilizations. We'll witness the moment when industrialization nearly erased millennia of tradition, and then the quiet rebellion that brought the old ways back from the brink of extinction. We'll explore the ongoing tension between safety and flavor, between tradition and innovation, between the local and the global tensions that define not just cheese, but much of our modern relationship with food itself. The merchant in his desert camp could never have imagined where his accidental discovery would lead, how it would become the foundation for countless regional cuisines, the subject of international trade disputes, the center of philosophical debates about authenticity and progress, how it would survive the collapse of empires, the rise of industrial agriculture, and the homogenizing forces of globalization to emerge. In our own time, more diverse and more valued than ever before. This is that story told not as distant history, but as lived experience, as if we had been there to witness each transformation, each innovation, each moment when human ingenuity turned challenge into opportunity. Because, in the end, the history of cheese is really the history of us. Curious, resourceful, endlessly hungry for something more than mere survival. Sleep well. Let the ancient world take shape around you as we begin this slow journey through time, following the thread of human invention from that first accidental miracle in the desert to the complex, beautiful world of cheese that surrounds us today. This is that story told not as distant history, but as lived experience, as if we had been there to witness each transformation, each innovation, each moment when human ingenuity turned challenge into opportunity. The consumer side of this equation was equally complex. Modern cheese buyers were simultaneously more sophisticated and more confused than their predecessors. They had access to more information about cheese production, more diverse products from around the world, and more opportunities to learn about traditional techniques and regional variations. But they also faced an overwhelming array of choices, marketing messages that could be misleading, and price pressures that often favored industrial products over artisanal ones. The rise of food media, specialty retailers, and cheese education programs had created a segment of informed consumers who understood the differences between industrial and artisanal production and were willing to pay premium prices for authentic products. These consumers became crucial allies for traditional producers, providing the economic support needed to maintain labor-intensive methods and the word-of-mouth marketing that could build sustainable businesses. But even informed consumers faced difficult choices. The safety advantages of pasteurized, industrially produced cheese were undeniable, particularly for vulnerable populations like pregnant women, young children, and immunocompromised individuals. The convenience of products that had long shelf lives, traveled well, and performed predictably in cooking applications met real needs in busy modern lives. The lower prices of industrial products mattered to families struggling with food budgets, regardless of their preferences for artisanal quality. I remember the conversations I witnessed between cheese retailers and customers, how they navigated these competing values and constraints. A knowledgeable cheesemonger might spend 20 minutes with a customer explaining the differences between various products, discussing flavor profiles and production methods, helping someone find products that matched their budget, safety requirements, and taste preferences. These interactions were educational experiences that could transform casual consumers into informed advocates for traditional production. But the same customer might later choose an industrial product at their local supermarket because it was convenient, familiar, or significantly cheaper. The choice between industrial efficiency and artisanal character wasn't made once, it was made repeatedly, in countless daily decisions that collectively shaped the direction of the global cheese market. The restaurant industry played a crucial role in these choices, as chefs and restaurateurs decided whether to feature authentic artisanal products or more affordable industrial alternatives. High-end restaurants increasingly emphasized local producers, traditional methods, and seasonal variations as part of their identity and value proposition. But casual dining establishments often chose industrial products that offered consistent performance and pricing, even if they sacrificed some flavor, complexity, and cultural authenticity. The technological advances that enabled global distribution also created new possibilities for transparency and connection between producers and consumers. QR codes on cheese labels could link to videos of production methods, profiles of individual makers, and detailed information about terroir and aging conditions. Social media allowed producers to share real-time updates about their work, seasonal changes in their products, and the daily realities of traditional cheese production. But technology also enabled more sophisticated forms of industrial production that could mimic some characteristics of artisanal cheese, while maintaining the efficiency and consistency of factory methods. Controlled bacterial cultures could approximate the complex microbial communities of traditional aging environments. Precise temperature and humidity control could replicate seasonal variations artificially. Advanced testing and quality control could ensure that industrial products met specific flavor and texture profiles consistently. These technological capabilities raised fundamental questions about authenticity and value. If industrial methods could produce cheese that tasted similar to traditional versions, what made the traditional methods worth preserving? Was the value of artisanal production primarily sensory better, flavor, and texture? Or was it cultural, environmental, and social, related to the preservation of traditional knowledge, support for rural communities, and connection to specific places and seasons? The answer, I realized, was that both perspectives had validity. For consumers whose primary concern was flavor and affordability, high-quality industrial cheese might provide excellent value and satisfaction. But for those who valued the broader cultural, environmental, and social dimensions of food production, traditional methods offered connections and meanings that industrial alternatives couldn't replicate, regardless of their sensory qualities. The eternal tension between efficiency and character, between innovation and tradition, between global accessibility and local authenticity, was not a problem to be solved, but a creative force that would continue driving cheese evolution. Each generation would face this tension anew, making choices that reflected their values, circumstances, and understanding of what food meant in their lives. The future of cheese would likely include both industrial production that met basic needs efficiently and affordably, and artisanal production that preserved traditional knowledge while adapting to contemporary conditions. The key was ensuring that consumers had genuine choices, accurate information, and access to both options, rather than allowing market forces or regulatory systems to eliminate either approach entirely. The young cheesemakers I met at farmers' markets and specialty shops gave me hope that this balance was achievable. They combined deep respect for traditional methods with practical understanding of contemporary market realities. They were willing to work long hours for modest financial returns because they found meaning in preserving and extending humanity's ancient partnership with the microbial communities that make cheese possible. But they also used modern tools and techniques selectively, adopting innovations that supported their core values while rejecting those that would compromise their product's character. They built online businesses that connected them directly with appreciative customers. They collaborated with restaurants and retailers who shared their commitment to quality and authenticity. They participated in educational programs that taught consumers to understand and value their work. Most importantly, they demonstrated that the choice between tradition and innovation was often a false dichotomy. The most successful traditional producers were also innovators, constantly experimenting with new approaches while maintaining the essential principles that made their products valuable. They understood that tradition was not static preservation of historical methods, but living practice that evolved thoughtfully in response to changing conditions. This dynamic understanding of tradition offered the best hope for navigating the eternal tension that defined the modern cheese world. Rather than choosing between efficiency and character, between global accessibility and local authenticity, between innovation and preservation, the future lay in finding creative ways to honor both sides of these apparent contradictions. The desert merchant whose accidental discovery had started this long journey could never have imagined the complex world his simple transformation had created. But perhaps he would have recognized the essential challenge that still faced every cheesemaker: how to work skillfully with natural processes that could never be completely controlled, how to balance human ambition with respect for the living systems that make cheese possible, how to create something enduring from the most perishable of ingredients. I remember standing in a modern supermarket dairy aisle, surrounded by the fluorescent hum of refrigeration units and rows of identical plastic-wrapped cheese blocks, when I first understood that we had arrived at a moment of profound choice. Here, within arm's reach of each other, sat two entirely different visions of what cheese could be: industrial efficiency perfected into seamless uniformity, and artisanal character preserved in wheels that bore the fingerprints of individual makers and the subtle variations of seasonal change. The fluorescent-lit shelves told one story of a food system that had conquered scarcity, inconsistency, and the inconveniences of seasonal variation. Processed cheese products promised the same flavor, texture, and melting characteristics every time, regardless of season or source. They could survive months in distribution, withstand temperature variations that would ruin traditional cheeses, and deliver predictable results to consumers who had learned to value reliability above complexity. But tucked into specialty sections and local markets, another story was unfolding. Wheels of cheese that carried the names of specific farms, specific makers, specific places. Cheeses that changed subtly with the seasons, that required careful handling, that might surprise you with unexpected depths of flavor or texture, variations that reflected the particular conditions of their creation. These products demanded more from consumers: higher prices, shorter shelf life, tolerance for variation, but they offered something that industrial products could never provide: connection to place, season, and the ancient partnership between human skill and natural processes. This tension between consistency and character had become the defining characteristic of the modern cheese world. It played out in every aspect of production, distribution, and consumption, from the regulatory frameworks that governed cheese safety to the marketing messages that shaped consumer expectations. The global success of halloumi illustrated both the opportunities and the threats that this tension created. This traditional Cypriot cheese, made from goat and sheep milk, and distinguished by its unique ability to hold its shape when grilled or fried, had found international markets that previous generations of Cypriot cheesemakers could never have imagined. Restaurants from London to Los Angeles featured halloumi in salads and appetizers, introducing millions of diners to flavors and textures that had once been confined to Mediterranean villages. But success brought its own challenges. As demand for halloumi grew beyond what traditional Cypriot producers could supply, manufacturers around the world began producing imitations that borrowed the name while abandoning the traditional methods, ingredients, and geographic origins that had originally defined the cheese. These industrial versions might look similar to authentic halloumi, but they lacked the complex flavors that came from traditional milk sources, aging methods, and the specific bacterial cultures that had evolved in Cyprus over centuries. I remember the legal battles that erupted as traditional producers fought to protect their products from industrial imitation. The European Union's protected designation of origin system offered some protection, granting legal recognition to authentic halloumi produced in Cyprus using traditional methods, but enforcement proved challenging in global markets where consumers often couldn't distinguish between authentic and imitation products, where price often mattered more than authenticity, and where industrial producers had marketing budgets that dwarfed those of traditional artisans. Similar struggles were playing out around the world. In Mexico, producers of traditional queso cotija faced competition from industrial versions that used the name but abandoned the time-intensive aging processes, specific milk sources, and mountaineer curing that had originally defined this cheese. The authentic product aged in caves in the Sierra de Jomich for months until it developed its characteristic hard texture and intense salty flavor. Couldn't compete on price with factory-produced versions that achieved superficially similar results in weeks rather than months. The irony was that globalization, the same force that threatened traditional cheese cultures by enabling industrial competition, also created unprecedented opportunities for authentic producers to reach appreciative consumers worldwide. A traditional cheesemaker in rural France could now sell directly to customers in New York or Tokyo through online platforms that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. Social media allowed producers to tell their stories, share their methods, and build personal relationships with consumers who valued authenticity and traditional craftsmanship. But these opportunities required traditional producers to navigate complex new challenges. They had to master digital marketing, international shipping regulations, and quality control systems that could ensure their products would arrive in good condition after traveling thousands of miles. They had to communicate across language and cultural barriers with consumers who might lack the context needed to understand what made their products special or worth premium prices. The regulatory framework that governed this global cheese trade reflected the same tensions between safety and character that had shaped cheese production since Pasteur's discoveries. Food safety requirements, designed primarily for industrial production, often created disproportionate burdens for small-scale traditional producers. The testing, documentation, and facility requirements needed for international trade favored large companies with specialized regulatory departments over individual craftspeople whose knowledge was primarily practical rather than bureaucratic. Yet, within these constraints, remarkable innovations were emerging as producers found ways to honor traditional principles while adapting to contemporary conditions. In Japan, cheesemakers were experimenting with sake-washing techniques that applied European rind-washing principles to distinctly Japanese ingredients, creating hybrid products that respected both traditions while exploring entirely new flavor territories. These fusion approaches represented a new phase in cheese evolution, one that embraced the global exchange of knowledge, while maintaining respect for traditional methods and local conditions. Japanese cheesemakers weren't simply copying European techniques, they were adapting them thoughtfully to Japanese ingredients, climate conditions, and cultural preferences, creating products that were simultaneously innovative and grounded in established principles of craftsmanship. I remember tasting one of these squashed cheeses and being struck by how it embodied the eternal tension that had always driven cheese evolution. The basic structure was recognizably European semi-soft cow's milk cheese with a washed rind that had developed complex, pungent flavors during aging. But the sake washing had introduced subtle notes that were entirely new, flavors that could only have emerged from the marriage of Japanese brewing traditions with European cheese-making techniques. This kind of thoughtful innovation represented the positive potential of globalization, not the homogenization that industrial production promoted, but the creative exchange of knowledge and techniques that could enrich traditional practices while respecting their essential character. The key was maintaining the fundamental principles that made traditional cheese production valuable: attention to terroir, respect for natural processes, commitment to quality over efficiency, and willingness to accept the variations and complexities that came with working with living systems. The alternative milk movement was pushing these boundaries even further, as producers experimented with cheese made from water buffalo, sheep, goats, and even more exotic sources like yak, camel, or reindeer milk. Each of these alternatives brought its own characteristics, different fat and protein structures, unique flavor profiles, varying seasonal availability that required adaptations of traditional techniques while opening possibilities for entirely new cheese styles. But the most profound innovations were often the quietest ones. Traditional producers who found ways to maintain their essential methods while adapting to contemporary market demands. A French cheesemaker might install modern temperature and humidity control systems in an ancient cave, gaining more precise control over aging conditions while preserving the microbial communities that had evolved there over centuries. An American artisan might use contemporary packaging materials and distribution networks, while maintaining traditional production methods and seasonal rhythms. These adaptations required careful judgment about which elements of tradition were essential, and which could be modified without compromising the product's character. The most successful traditional producers were those who understood that preservation of authentic methods didn't require rejection of all contemporary tools and techniques, but rather selective adoption of innovations that supported rather than undermined their core values. Slow food responded to this crisis by creating support networks for traditional producers, educational programs to preserve and transmit traditional knowledge, and marketing initiatives that connected artisanal producers with consumers who valued their products. The movement recognized that preserving food cultures required more than just documenting traditional techniques. It required creating economic and social conditions that would make traditional production viable for new generations. The political dimensions of this work became increasingly evident as the movement grew beyond its Italian origins. Supporting traditional food production was not just a matter of consumer choice, but of public policy. Government regulations, trade agreements, agricultural subsidies, and zoning laws all influenced whether traditional producers could survive in competition with industrial operations. The European Union's development of protected designation of origin (PDO) regulations represented a partial victory for slow food principles. These rules recognized that certain foods were inseparable from their geographic origins and production methods, and they provided legal protection against imitation products that might confuse consumers or undercut authentic producers. Parmigiano Reggiano, Roquefort, and dozens of other traditional cheeses gained legal recognition as unique cultural products that could only be authentically produced in specific places using traditional methods. But the PDO system also revealed the tensions between protecting tradition and allowing innovation. Some traditional producers argued that the regulations were too rigid, preventing them from adapting their methods to changing conditions or experimenting with improvements to their products. Others worried that legal protection might lead to commercialization that would undermine the artisanal character they were trying to preserve. I remember the debates within the slow food movement about how to balance preservation of traditional methods with the need to make traditional food production economically viable in contemporary markets. Some advocates argued for strict adherence to historical practices, viewing any modernization as a betrayal of authentic tradition. Others maintained that traditional producers had always adapted their methods to changing conditions, and that survival required continued evolution rather than The resolution of this tension often came through the concept of presidia projects that supported traditional producers while allowing them to adapt their methods thoughtfully, rather than abandoning them entirely. A presidium might help traditional cheesemakers upgrade their facilities to meet modern health standards while preserving their essential production techniques, or it might assist them in developing sustainable packaging and distribution methods that could reach broader markets without compromising product quality. The success of these initiatives demonstrated that traditional food production could be both economically viable and culturally authentic when it was supported by consumers, policies, and institutions that understood its value. But it also revealed how much work was required to create these supportive conditions. Traditional food cultures hadn't declined accidentally. They had been systematically undermined by economic and regulatory systems that favored industrial production. The global expansion of the slow food movement showed how universal these challenges were. From American artisan cheesemakers struggling with pasteurization requirements to protect Mexican producers fighting to protect traditional varieties from industrial imitation, food cultures around the world were facing similar pressures from globalization, industrialization, and regulatory systems designed for large-scale production. But the movement also demonstrated the power of networks that connected traditional producers with each other and with consumers who valued their work. When a traditional Sicilian cheese was featured at a slow food event, it might be tasted by visitors from Japan, California, or Australia who would return home with new appreciation for artisanal production and perhaps inspiration to support similar producers in their own regions. The educational dimension of slow food proved to be as important as its economic and political work. Many consumers, particularly in industrialized countries, had lost the knowledge needed to appreciate traditional foods. They might prefer the complex flavors of artisanal cheese when they had the opportunity to taste it, but they lacked the cultural context needed to understand what made it valuable or worth premium prices. Slow food's response was to create educational experiences that taught people not just to consume traditional foods, but to understand them. Cheese tastings became lessons in terroir, seasonal variation, and traditional production methods. Visitors learned to recognize the signs of proper aging, to appreciate the relationship between flavor and production methods, to understand why certain cheeses could only be made in certain places at certain times of year. This educational work was inherently political because it challenged the assumptions about food that industrial marketing had promoted for decades. Instead of emphasizing convenience, consistency, and low prices, slow food taught people to value complexity, seasonal variation, and fair pricing that supported sustainable production. Instead of treating food as fuel, it encouraged people to see eating as a cultural activity that connected them to places, communities, and traditions. The movement's influence extended far beyond the food world into broader questions about sustainability, globalization, and cultural preservation. The principles of good, clean, and fair could be applied to any form of production, and they offered a framework for thinking about alternatives to the industrial model that had dominated most sectors of the economy since the 19th century. But perhaps the most profound contribution of slow food was its demonstration that resistance to industrialization didn't require rejecting all aspects of modernity. Traditional producers could use contemporary transportation, communication, and marketing methods while preserving the essential characteristics that made their products unique and valuable. The challenge was to adapt selectively, adopting innovations that supported traditional values while rejecting those that undermined them. The cheese world that emerged from decades of slow food influence was dramatically different from the one that had existed in 1986. Traditional producers had gained legal protection, economic support, and consumer appreciation that had seemed impossible during the dark years of industrial consolidation. New generations of cheesemakers were learning traditional techniques and adapting them to contemporary conditions. Most importantly, consumers had rediscovered their appetite for foods that expressed the complexity and character that only traditional methods could provide. I remember the moment in 1986 when Carlo Petrini stood in the Piazza di Spagna in Rome, watching protesters wave flags and shout slogans not about politics or economics, but about a McDonald's restaurant that was about to open in the shadow of the Spanish Steps. The demonstration seemed almost quaint to observers who were accustomed to more conventional forms of political activism. But Petrini understood that something profound was at stake, nothing less than the survival of food cultures that had sustained human communities for millennia. The opening of McDonald's in Rome was symbolic rather than catastrophic in itself. One fast food restaurant could hardly destroy the rich culinary traditions of Italy overnight, but it represented the leading edge of a global transformation that was already reshaping how people around the world thought about food, time, and the relationship between eating and living. The standardized, industrialized, speed-obsessed model of food production and consumption that McDonald's epitomized threatened to make traditional food cultures obsolete by making them seem inefficient, inconvenient, and economically unviable. Petrini's response to this threat was characteristically Italian in its combination of intellectual rigor and passionate commitment to pleasure. Rather than simply opposing fast food, he articulated an alternative philosophy that would become known as slow fooder movement, built around three deceptively simple principles: good, clean, and fair. These words, which might have seemed like marketing slogans in another context, actually represented a sophisticated critique of industrial food systems and a blueprint for resistance that would influence food movements around the world. Good meant more than just pleasant taste, though pleasure was certainly central to the slow food philosophy. It encompassed the entire sensory experience of eating: the texture, aroma, appearance, and cultural context that made food satisfying rather than merely nutritious. industrial food production, in pursuit of efficiency and standardization, had systematically eliminated many of these sensory qualities, reducing food to fuel rather than celebrating it as one of life's fundamental pleasures. The emphasis on goodness also implied a rejection of the puritanical attitudes toward food that characterized much of modern nutrition science. Slow food advocates argued that the pleasures of eating were not frivolous luxuries but essential components of human well-being, that cultures which maintained strong food traditions were generally healthier and happier than those which had surrendered their culinary heritage to industrial convenience. I remember how this emphasis on pleasure initially puzzled and sometimes offended American audiences, who had been conditioned to think about food primarily in terms of health, convenience, or moral virtue. The idea that enjoying food was itself a form of cultural and political action seemed foreign to a society that had learned to distrust appetite and treat eating as a necessary but potentially dangerous activity that needed to be carefully controlled and regulated. Clean addressed the environmental and health consequences of industrial agriculture that had become increasingly evident by the 1980s. The chemical inputs, energy consumption, and waste production associated with large-scale food production were creating problems that extended far beyond individual farms or processing facilities. Pesticide residues in food, soil degradation from intensive farming, water pollution from agricultural runoff, and the carbon emissions from long-distance food transportation were all symptoms of a food system that prioritized short-term efficiency over long-term sustainability. But clean also meant something deeper than environmental responsibility. It implied transparency in production methods, honesty about ingredients and processes, and respect for the natural cycles that had sustained agriculture for thousands of years. Industrial food production had become increasingly opaque, with complex supply chains that made it difficult or impossible for consumers to understand how their food was produced, where it came from, or what inputs had been used in its creation. Traditional cheesemaking exemplified the clean principle perfectly. Artisanal producers typically worked with milk from animals they knew, using methods they could explain completely, in facilities that were open to inspection by anyone interested in understanding their practices. The ingredients were simple and recognizable, the processes were transparent, and the environmental impact was generally minimal because production was scaled to local resources and markets. Fair was perhaps the most radical of the three principles, because it challenged the economic assumptions that had driven industrial food production since the 19th century. The relentless pursuit of lower consumer prices had created a system where the true costs of food production were externalized, shifted to farm workers who were paid by low living wages, to rural communities that bore the environmental costs of intensive agriculture, to future generations who would inherit degraded soils and depleted water systems. Fair meant acknowledging and paying these true costs, ensuring that food producers could earn dignified livings while maintaining sustainable practices. It meant recognizing that cheap food was often cheap only because someone else, workers, communities, ecosystems, was bearing hidden costs that didn't appear in retail prices. For cheese, specifically, it meant supporting traditional producers whose knowledge and skills were being systematically undervalued by markets that prioritized volume and consistency over craftsmanship and regional character. The slow food movement's critique of industrial agriculture was particularly powerful because it came not from outside, the food system, but from within food cultures that were experiencing its effects firsthand. Italian producers and consumers had direct experience with both traditional and industrial methods, and they could compare the results in terms of flavor, environmental impact, and community vitality. I remember the cheese festival in Bra, Italy, where slow food's philosophy took concrete form in celebrations that were simultaneously educational, political, and pleasurable. Visitors could taste hundreds of traditional cheeses from across Europe and beyond, each one representing a unique combination of local conditions, traditional knowledge, and artisanal skill. The festival demonstrated that diversity in cheese was not just aesthetically pleasing, but economically viable, that consumers would pay premium prices for authentic products when they understood the stories behind them. But the festivals also revealed the challenges facing traditional producers. Many of the cheesemakers were elderly, with no obvious successors to carry on their knowledge and techniques. The bureaucratic requirements for legally producing and selling traditional cheeses were often so complex and expensive that small-scale producers couldn't afford to comply. The economics of artisanal production made it difficult to compete with industrial products, even when consumers preferred the traditional versions. The aging shepherds who brought their cheeses to Brawl represented a broader crisis in traditional food production. Across Europe, rural communities were losing population as young people moved to cities, seeking economic opportunities that traditional agriculture could no longer provide. The knowledge systems that had sustained regional food cultures for centuries were disappearing as the last generation of traditional producers retired or died without passing on their skills. The labor was demanding and often unpredictable. Unlike factory workers who performed the same tasks repeatedly, artisan cheesemakers had to master every aspect of production, from animal husbandry and milk handling to bacterial cultivation and inventory management. They worked long hours for uncertain financial returns, driven by passion for their craft rather than conventional business incentives. But this intensive, hands-on approach also enabled innovations that would have been impossible in industrial settings. Small-scale producers could experiment with different milk sources, aging techniques, and flavor combinations without the massive financial risks that characterized large-scale production. They could adjust their methods seasonally, taking advantage of changes in milk composition and environmental conditions that industrial producers treated as problems to be controlled rather than opportunities to be explored. The American artisan movement also benefited from the country's cultural diversity and geographic variety. Unlike European cheesemaking, which was bound by centuries of regional tradition, American producers felt free to draw inspiration from multiple traditions and adapt them to local conditions. They created hybrid styles that combined French techniques with Italian aging methods, or applied traditional European approaches to distinctly American ingredients like buffalo milk or sheep's milk from breeds that had never been used for cheesemaking in their countries of origin. This experimental freedom produced remarkable innovations. Cheesemakers in California developed styles that took advantage of the state's unique climate and agricultural resources. Producers in Vermont created cheeses that expressed the particular character of New England pastures and weather patterns. Artisans in Wisconsin, with access to that state's rich dairy tradition, created products that honored historical techniques while pushing the boundaries of what American cheese could become. The movement also attracted people who brought skills from other fields, scientists who understood microbiology, artists who appreciated the aesthetic dimensions of cheesemaking, entrepreneurs who could navigate the business challenges of small-scale food production. This diversity of backgrounds contributed to the rapid innovation and quality improvement that characterized the American artisan cheese renaissance. By the 1990s, the quiet revolution that had begun with a few pioneers like Chenell and Hooper was becoming a recognized segment of the American food landscape. Specialty food stores began dedicating significant shelf space to domestic artisan cheeses. Restaurants started featuring American producers alongside traditional European imports. Food writers and critics began paying serious attention to American cheesemaking, recognizing that the quality gap between domestic artisan products and imported European cheeses was rapidly closing. I remember the moment when this recognition became international. American artisan cheeses began winning awards at European competitions, validating the quality and authenticity of products that had been dismissed as inferior imitations just a few years earlier. European cheesemakers, many of whom had initially been skeptical of American efforts, began acknowledging their transatlantic colleagues as legitimate practitioners of the ancient craft. The success of the artisan movement also began to influence larger producers, who recognized that consumers were increasingly willing to pay premium prices for products that offered authentic flavor, traditional production methods, and connection to specific places and producers. Some industrial cheese companies began developing specialty lines that attempted to capture the market appeal of artisan products while maintaining the efficiency of large-scale production. But the most profound impact of the artisan cheese revolution was cultural rather than commercial. The movement demonstrated that alternatives to industrial food production were not only possible, but economically viable. It showed that American consumers, despite decades of conditioning toward convenience and low prices, were hungry for foods that offered complexity, authenticity, and connection to traditional methods of production. The success of artisan cheesemaking helped lay the groundwork for broader changes in American food. Culture the farm-to-table movement, the emphasis on locally sourced ingredients, the growing appreciation for seasonal variation and regional specialties. It proved that the knowledge and techniques that industrialization had nearly eliminated could be recovered, adapted, and made relevant to contemporary conditions. Most importantly, the American artisan cheese movement preserved and extended humanity's ancient partnership with the microbial communities that make cheesemaking possible at a time when industrial food production was becoming increasingly divorced from natural processes. These small-scale producers maintained traditions of working with living systems, accepting variability, and celebrating the complex flavors that emerge from patient collaboration between human skill and natural fermentation. The revolution that began in Laura Chenell's goat barn was indeed quieted, proceeded without manifestos, political declarations, or dramatic confrontations with established powers. Instead, it advanced wheel by wheel, farm by farm, market by market, as individuals chose to support producers who shared their values and appreciated their commitment to quality, authenticity, and environmental responsibility. Yet, for all its quiet methods, the artisan cheese movement represented a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that had governed American food production. For most of the 20th century, it suggested that bigger was not always better, that efficiency was not the only valuable goal, that standardization was not necessarily progress. It demonstrated that consumers would pay premium prices for products that offered genuine quality and authentic character, even when cheaper alternatives were readily available. The stage was now set for the next phase of this ongoing transformation, one that would extend beyond individual producers and consumers to encompass broader questions about food policy, environmental sustainability, and the role of traditional knowledge in an increasingly globalized world. I remember the California sunshine filtering through the windows of Laura Chennell's Small Goat barn in the early 1980s, how the light seemed to illuminate more than just the cheese-making equipment scattered around the modest space. Here, in Sonoma County, something remarkable was happening. Quiet rebellion against everything the industrial food system had built, led by a woman who had never intended to become a revolutionary. Chennell's story began, like so many transformative journeys, with a moment of profound dissatisfaction. She had returned to California from France with memories of goat cheeses that possessed flavors and textures she had never experienced in America. The fresh she had tasted in French markets was nothing like the bland, processed cheese products that dominated American supermarkets. It was alive, complex, expressive of the particular place and season where it had been made. It represented everything that industrial standardization had systematically eliminated from the American cheese landscape. But when Chennell tried to recreate these French cheeses in her California kitchen, she encountered obstacles that revealed the depth of what had been lost during the decades of industrialization. The techniques for making traditional goat cheese were not documented in American cookbooks or agricultural extension publications. The bacterial cultures needed for proper fermentation were not available through normal commercial channels. Even the goats themselves bred for maximum milk production. Rather than flavor, complexity produced milk that lacked the character of their French counterparts. Undeterred, Chennell embarked on a pilgrimage that would become the template for the American artisan cheese renaissance. She returned to France, this time not as a tourist but as an apprentice, working alongside traditional cheesemakers who had maintained their craft despite the pressures of modernization. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when milk was ready for culturing, when curds had reached the proper consistency for draining, when aging conditions were optimal for flavor development. But more importantly, she absorbed the philosophy that lay beneath these technical skills. French cheesemakers, she discovered, approached their craft not as a manufacturing process, but as a form of agriculture, a partnership with living systems that required patience, observation, and respect for natural cycles. They understood that great cheese could not be rushed or standardized, that the best products emerged from careful attention to countless variables that industrial methods had taught Americans to ignore or control. I remember the countercultural atmosphere of 1970s California that made Chennell's experiment possible. This was the era of the Back to the Land movement, when young Americans disillusioned with industrial society were seeking alternative ways of living that emphasized sustainability, craftsmanship, and connection to natural processes, the same impulse that drove people to grow organic vegetables, bake whole-grain bread, and explore traditional crafts also created a receptive audience for authentic, handcrafted cheese. The movement was deeply political, though its politics were expressed through lifestyle choices rather than conventional activism. By choosing to support small-scale, artisanal food production, consumers were implicitly rejecting the industrial agriculture system that prioritized efficiency and profit over environmental sustainability, product quality, and community well-being. Every wheel of artisanal cheese represented a vote for an alternative vision of how food should be produced and consumed. Women played a disproportionately important role in this emerging artisan cheese movement, perhaps because they were less invested in the male-dominated industrial systems that had defined 20th century agriculture. Pioneers like Alison Hooper, who founded Vermont Creamery in 1984 after learning traditional techniques from European masters, brought a different sensibility to cheesemaking, one that emphasized collaboration over competition, quality over quantity, and environmental stewardship over short-term profit maximization. Hooper's journey paralleled Chanel's in many ways. Frustrated by the lack of authentic, fresh cheeses available in America, she traveled to France to study with traditional producers who could teach her the skills that had been lost during the decades of industrial consolidation. Like Chanel, she discovered that recreating traditional European cheeses in America required more than just following recipes, required rebuilding entire systems of knowledge, relationships, and cultural values that industrialization had systematically dismantled. The challenges these pioneers faced were formidable. American dairy infrastructure had been designed to support large-scale, standardized production. Small-scale cheesemakers had difficulty finding appropriate milk sources, bacterial cultures, aging facilities, and distribution networks. Regulatory systems designed for industrial producers often created bureaucratic obstacles that were nearly insurmountable for artisanal operations. Consumer tastes, shaped by decades of industrial products, often needed to be educated before they could appreciate the complexity and variation that characterized traditional cheeses. But perhaps the greatest challenge was cultural. American food culture in the 1970s and 1980s had been conditioned to value convenience, consistency, and low prices above all other considerations. The idea that food could be art, that flavor complexity was worth paying premium prices for, that seasonal variation was a benefit rather than a problem, these concepts required a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about their relationship with food. The artisan cheesemakers succeeded by creating new networks of production and distribution that bypassed the industrial food system entirely. They sold directly to consumers at farmers' markets, establishing personal relationships that allowed them to educate customers about their products and production methods. They partnered with restaurants and specialty food stores that shared their commitment to quality and authenticity. Most importantly, they created communities of producers who shared knowledge, supported each other's businesses, and collectively worked to establish American artisanal cheese as a legitimate alternative to both domestic industrial products and imported European varieties. I remember the physical intensity of early artisan cheese production, how different it was from the mechanized efficiency of factory operations. These small-scale producers worked with their hands, developing the tactile sensitivity needed to assess curd formation, monitor aging progress, and adjust techniques based on subtle changes in milk quality or environmental conditions. They aged their cheeses in converted caves, repurposed buildings, and custom-built facilities that prioritized proper temperature and humidity control over production efficiency. The timing of these changes was particularly cruel for traditional cheesemaking. Just as industrial production was consolidating the industry and eliminating many small-scale producers, pasteurization requirements threatened to eliminate the distinctive characteristics that had made artisanal cheese worth preserving in the first place. Producers who survived the economic pressures of industrialization now faced technical requirements that made it nearly impossible to maintain their traditional products. The regulatory framework that developed around pasteurization created a permanent division in the cheese world between countries that prioritized safety above all other considerations and those that were willing to accept some risk in order to preserve traditional food cultures. The United States adopted some of the most restrictive approaches, requiring pasteurization for most commercially sold cheeses and effectively banning the importation of many traditional European varieties. France, perhaps more than any other country, struggled with this conflict between safety and tradition. As the birthplace of some of the world's most celebrated cheeses, France had the most to lose from pasteurization requirements. French cheesemakers, supported by consumers who valued traditional products, fought to preserve the right to produce raw milk cheeses under controlled conditions that would minimize health risks while preserving traditional characteristics. The compromise that eventually emerged in France and other European countries involved sophisticated systems of monitoring, testing, and quality control that would allow raw milk cheese production to continue under strict supervision. Producers had to meet exacting standards for animal health, milking hygiene, and aging conditions. Regular testing ensured that finished products met safety standards without requiring pasteurization of the original milk. But these regulatory compromises came at a cost. The compliance requirements were expensive and technically demanding, favoring larger producers who could afford the necessary equipment, testing, and record-keeping systems. Small-scale traditional producers, who often possessed the deepest knowledge of their craft, were frequently unable to meet the bureaucratic and technical requirements for legal raw milk cheese production. I remember the irony that scientific advances designed to make food safer actually created new categories of risk for traditional food cultures. The same period that saw dramatic improvements in understanding food safety also witnessed the systematic elimination of countless traditional food production methods that had sustained human communities for centuries. The pasteurization debate crystallized broader tensions about the role of risk in human life and the value of traditional knowledge versus scientific expertise. Proponents of pasteurization argued that no flavor or tradition was worth risking human lives, particularly the lives of children who were most vulnerable to milk-borne diseases. Critics countered that eliminating all risk also eliminated much of what made food culturally meaningful and nutritionally complex. The scientific evidence supported both sides, depending on how risk and benefit were calculated. Pasteurization undoubtedly prevented disease and saved lives, particularly in urban settings where traditional quality control methods were impractical. But it also eliminated beneficial bacteria, reduced nutritional complexity, and severed the connection between food and its environmental origins that had been fundamental to traditional food cultures. The long-term implications extended beyond individual health or cultural preservation to questions about humanity's relationship with the microbial world. Traditional food production had been based on selective partnerships with beneficial microorganisms, sophisticated systems of cultivation and control that had been refined over millennia. Pasteurization represented a more aggressive approach that sought to eliminate microbial activity entirely, then selectively reintroduce only those organisms that were deemed safe and useful. This shift from partnership to control reflected broader changes in how industrial societies approached natural processes. The same logic that drove pasteurization, that human safety required the systematic elimination of uncontrolled biological activity, would eventually be applied to agriculture, medicine, and environmental management, with consequences that are still unfolding today. But in the immediate context of cheese production, pasteurization created a permanent divide that would shape the industry for generations to come. On one side were producers and consumers who prioritized safety, consistency, and regulatory compliance above traditional characteristics. On the other were those who believed that authentic cheese required accepting the risks that came with working with raw, living ingredients. The technical solutions that emerged from this divide would eventually become increasingly sophisticated, as food scientists learned to manipulate bacterial cultures, control aging environments, and engineer flavor development in ways that approximated but never completely replicated traditional processes. The science of microbiology that Pasteur had founded would eventually produce techniques for creating complex flavors and textures without the unpredictable elements that had characterized traditional cheesemaking. Yet the fundamental question remained unresolved, whether food that was completely safe could also be completely satisfying, whether the elimination of risk necessarily required the elimination of character, whether human health was best served by sterile safety or by careful partnership with the microbial communities that had shaped human nutrition throughout history. The stage was now set for a rebellion that few could have predicted, one that would emerge not from the traditional cheese-making regions of Europe, but from the unlikely landscape of 1970s California, where a new generation of Americans would challenge everything the industrial food system had built and fight to reclaim the complexity that pasteurization and mass production had systematically eliminated. I remembered the moment when Louis Pasteur first peered through his microscope and saw the invisible armies that had haunted human food production for millennia. It was 1856, and the French chemist was investigating why certain batches of wine and beer spoiled, while others did not. What he discovered in those magnified drops of liquid would transform not just the beverage industry, but humanity's entire relationship with the microbial world, including the ancient partnership between cheesemakers and the bacteria that made their craft possible. Under the lens, previously clear liquids revealed themselves to be teeming with life. Tiny organisms swam and multiplied, some beneficial, others destructive, all invisible to the naked eye, but enormously powerful in their effects. Pasteur realized that fermentation, that mysterious process that transformed grape juice into wine, grain into beer, and milk into cheese, was not a chemical reaction as scientists had believed, but a biological one driven by living organisms that could be either cultivated or destroyed. The implications were staggering. For the first time in human history, the invisible enemies that caused food to spoil made people sick, and turned carefully prepared provisions into sources of suffering could be seen, understood, and potentially controlled. The random variation in fermentation success that had puzzled producers for centuries suddenly made sense. Batches succeeded or failed based on which microorganisms happened to colonize them during production. Pasteur's breakthrough came with his development of the process that would bear his name: pasteurization, by heating liquids to specific temperatures for carefully controlled periods. He could kill harmful bacteria while preserving the beneficial ones needed for fermentation. The technique was elegant in its simplicity, revolutionary in its implications, and devastating in its effects on traditional food production methods. I remember trying to imagine the excitement that must have swept through scientific circles as news of Pasteur's discoveries spread. Here was proof that the ancient scourges of food poisoning, spoilage, and unpredictable fermentation could be conquered through human knowledge and intervention. The invisible world that had operated beyond human control since the beginning of civilization could finally be managed, directed, and made safe. But the application of pasteurization to milk and cheese production created conflicts that went far beyond scientific questions. The high temperatures required to kill dangerous bacteria also destroyed many of the beneficial microorganisms that gave traditional cheeses their distinctive flavors, textures, and regional characteristics. The same process that made milk safe also made it sterile, eliminating not just harmful pathogens, but the entire microbial ecosystem that had evolved over centuries of cheesemaking tradition. The public health benefits were undeniable. Urban centers in the late 19th century were experiencing deadly outbreaks of milk-borne diseases that killed thousands of people, particularly children, every year. Tuberculosis, typhoid fever, diphtheria, and other bacterial infections spread rapidly through contaminated milk supplies that served growing cities. The milk delivery systems that had developed to feed urban populations were also efficient distribution networks for deadly pathogens. Traditional rural communities, where people consumed milk from animals they knew and cared for themselves, had always faced these risks, but on a smaller, more manageable scale. When contamination occurred, it typically affected individual families rather than entire neighborhoods. Urban milk distribution, however, could carry infection from a single contaminated source to hundreds or thousands of consumers, creating public health crises that demanded immediate, systematic intervention. Pasteurization offered a solution that was both technically feasible and economically practical. Milk processors could install heating equipment that would eliminate dangerous bacteria without requiring fundamental changes to production, distribution, or consumption patterns. Urban consumers could continue buying milk with confidence that it wouldn't make their children sick. Public health officials could reduce disease outbreaks without having to transform the entire urban food system. But traditional cheesemakers viewed pasteurization with deep suspicion, and for good reason. The bacterial cultures that Pasteur's process destroyed were not just random microorganisms. They were the living libraries of flavor, texture, and aroma that had been cultivated over centuries of careful selection and environmental adaptation. Each traditional cheese represented a unique microbial ecosystem that had evolved to produce specific characteristics under particular conditions. Raw milk cheese was the ultimate expression of terroir, because it preserved and concentrated all the environmental influences that shaped its character. The bacteria that lived on local plants, in local soils, in the air of local aging facilities, these invisible communities were literally what made each regional cheese unique. Pasteurization destroyed this biological fingerprint, creating a blank slate that could only be recolonized by bacteria that were deliberately reintroduced after heating. I remember the anguish that traditional European cheesemakers must have felt as they watched pasteurization requirements spread across the continent. Producers who had spent lifetimes learning to work with their local microbial communities suddenly found themselves forced to start over with sterilized milk that bore no resemblance to the living ingredient their techniques had been designed to transform. The new pasteurized cheese production required completely different skills and approaches. Instead of partnering with existing bacterial communities, cheesemakers had to learn to inoculate sterile milk with carefully selected cultures that would produce predictable results. The intuitive knowledge that came from working with raw milk, the ability to sense when conditions were right for specific bacterial activities, became irrelevant when working with standardized, sterilized ingredients. The flavor implications were profound. Raw milk cheeses possessed layers of complexity that reflected the full spectrum of microbial activity in their original environment. Pasteurized versions, even when made with identical techniques and aging procedures, inevitably tasted flatter, less complex, less expressive of their origins. The subtle variations that had made traditional cheeses endlessly interesting were replaced by more predictable but also more monotonous flavor profiles. The texture changes were equally significant. The enzymes naturally present in raw milk contributed to the breakdown of proteins during aging, creating the creamy, complex textures that characterized traditional cheeses. Pasteurization destroyed these enzymes, requiring cheesemakers to add artificial substitutes that approximated but never perfectly replicated the natural processes that had shaped traditional products. The factory system also changed the skills required for cheese production. Traditional cheesemaking demanded deep, intuitive knowledge developed through years of hands-on experience. Factory workers needed to master specific procedures quickly and execute them consistently. But they didn't need to understand the underlying principles that governed fermentation, aging, and flavor development. The knowledge that had once resided in individual craftspeople was increasingly embedded in machinery, standardized procedures, and management systems. This division between thinking and doing had profound implications for the preservation of traditional knowledge. When master cheesemakers died or retired, their expertise often died with them because there were no apprentices learning the complete craft. Factory workers might become highly skilled at specific tasks, operating presses, monitoring temperatures, managing inventory, but they rarely developed the comprehensive understanding that would allow them to recreate traditional products or innovate successfully with new approaches. The steam-powered equipment that made factory production possible also created new possibilities for controlling and manipulating the cheese-making process. Mechanical presses could apply consistent pressure that human workers could never maintain. Steam heating could provide more precise temperature control than traditional fires. Standardized vats could process larger quantities of milk while maintaining more uniform conditions throughout the batch. But these technological advantages came with their own limitations. The machinery was expensive, requiring significant capital investment that favored large operations over small ones. It was also inflexible, designed to produce specific types of cheese efficiently, rather than to accommodate the experimental approaches that had driven traditional innovation. Factory equipment worked best when producing the same products repeatedly, using the same procedures and the same ingredients, which naturally led to standardization and homogenization. The economic logic of factory production also favored cheese styles that were well suited to mass manufacturing and long-distance distribution. Hard cheeses that could withstand rough handling and extended storage periods were preferred, over delicate varieties that required careful treatment. Styles that aged predictably and uniformly were favored over those that might develop individual characteristics that varied from wheel to wheel. The result was a narrowing of the cheese spectrum, with commercial production concentrating on a few reliable varieties, while hundreds of traditional styles were abandoned or relegated to small-scale specialty production. I remember the social disruption that accompanied this economic transformation. Traditional cheesemaking had been integrated into larger patterns of rural life, seasonal rhythms, and family relationships. Fathers taught sons, mothers taught daughters, and knowledge flowed naturally from one generation to the next through daily practice and gradual apprenticeship. Factory production disrupted these patterns by separating cheesemaking from its traditional cultural context and transforming it into wage labor performed by workers who might have no personal connection to dairy farming or food production. The factory system also changed the relationship between producers and consumers. Traditional cheesemaking had operated within local or regional markets where buyers often knew the individual farmers or cheesemakers who produced their food. This personal connection created accountability and encouraged quality because reputation directly affected sales. Factory production sold through impersonal distribution networks where consumers had no relationship with producers and little information about production methods beyond basic labeling requirements. The standardization that made factory cheese reliable also made it predictable in ways that traditional products had never been. Consumers could buy cheddar from the same manufacturer month after month and expect identical flavor, texture, and appearance. This consistency was undeniably convenient, but it also reduced food to a commodity rather than an expression of place, season, or individual skill. The surprises and variations that had once been part of the charm of traditional cheese were systematically eliminated in favor of products that met predetermined specifications. But perhaps the most profound change was philosophical. Traditional cheesemaking had been based on partnership with natural processes that could be guided but never completely controlled. Factory production sought to replace this partnership with control. Systems that would minimize variability and maximize predictability. The goal was not to work with natural cycles, but to transcend them, creating products that would be the same regardless of season, weather, or local conditions. This shift from partnership to control represented a fundamental change in humanity's relationship with food production, where traditional methods had required patience, observation, and acceptance of natural variation. Industrial methods demanded efficiency, standardization, and the elimination of unpredictable elements. The wisdom of traditional cheesemakers, their ability to read subtle signs and adjust their methods accordingly, was replaced by systematic procedures designed to produce consistent results without requiring individual judgment or expertise. The implications extended far beyond cheese into the broader transformation of food systems that would characterize the industrial age. The same principles that Jesse Williams applied to cheese production, centralization, standardization, mechanization, and the pursuit of efficiency over individual expression would eventually be applied to virtually every aspect of food production, from agriculture to processing to distribution. Yet, even at the height of industrial enthusiasm, some observers recognized what was being lost in this transformation. The diversity, complexity, and individual character that had defined traditional food production represented thousands of years of human cultural development. The knowledge embedded in traditional practices reflected sophisticated understanding of natural processes that had been refined through countless generations of careful observation and experimentation. The factory system promised abundance, consistency, and affordability, and it largely delivered on these promises. But it also created a food system that was increasingly divorced from natural cycles, local conditions, and individual craftsmanship. The cheese that emerged from Jesse Williams's factory and thousands of others like it was undeniably successful in commercial terms, but it also represented the beginning of a long process of homogenization that would eventually threaten the survival of traditional food cultures around the world. The sound of machinery that had announced this transformation in 1851 would echo through the following decades, spread across Europe and North America. But it would also eventually provoke a counterreaction as people who valued diversity, tradition, and individual expression began to question whether efficiency and standardization were adequate substitutes for the complexity and character that industrial production had systematically eliminated. I remember the sound that changed everything. The rhythmic clank of machinery echoing through Jesse Williams's factory in Rome, New York, on a cold morning in 1851. It was a sound that had never existed before in the long history of human cheesemaking, the mechanical precision of assembly line production replacing the ancient rhythms of individual craft. Where once there had been the splash of whey draining through hand-woven baskets, now there was the steady hiss of steam-powered presses. Where once there had been the patient footsteps of individual cheesemakers tending their wheels, now there was the coordinated movement of workers feeding a system designed for efficiency rather than artistry. Williams was not a cheesemaker by training or tradition. He was an entrepreneur, a man who looked at the growing cities of 19th-century America and saw opportunity in the gap between supply and demand. Urban populations were expanding faster than local food production could accommodate. Railroads were creating the possibility of long-distance food distribution, but the traditional model of farmhouse cheesemaking, where individual families produced small quantities for local consumption, could never meet the scale of demand that industrializing America was creating. The solution Williams pioneered was deceptively simple. Instead of hundreds of farm families, each making their own small batches of cheese, why not centralize the process? Collect milk from multiple farms, process it in a single facility with specialized equipment and trained workers, and produce standardized wheels that could be shipped to distant markets without the quality variations that made traditional farmhouse cheese unreliable for commercial distribution. The first cheese factory represented more than just a change in production methods. It was a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with food. For thousands of years, cheese had been made by people who knew their animals, understood their local conditions, and took personal responsibility for every aspect of the process, from milking to aging. The factory system severed these connections, creating a division of labor where specialized workers performed repetitive tasks without necessarily understanding the broader process they were contributing to. I remember trying to imagine the cultural shock this must have represented for traditional cheesemakers, farmers who had spent generations perfecting techniques passed down through their families, suddenly found themselves delivering raw milk to facilities where strangers transformed it, using methods optimized for volume and consistency rather than individual expression. The intimate knowledge that came from working with the same animals, the same pastures, the same aging environments was replaced by standardized procedures designed to work regardless of seasonal variations or local conditions. The economic pressures that drove industrialization were undeniable. Factory production could achieve economies of scale that individual farmers could never match. Standardized products could be marketed over wider geographic areas. Professional management could implement quality control measures that reduced the variability that plagued traditional production. The factory system offered consumers more reliable availability, more consistent quality, and lower prices than artisanal methods could provide. But these advantages came at costs that were not immediately apparent. The consolidation of production meant that the distinctive characteristics that had defined regional cheese traditions began to disappear. When milk from dozens of different farms was blended in large vats, the subtle influences of specific pastures, local water sources, and individual bacterial communities were averaged out and lost. The result was cheese that was consistent and predictable, but also homogenized and bland compared to the complex, variable products of traditional methods. The rise of factory production coincided with changes in agricultural practices that further eroded the foundations of traditional cheesemaking. As dairy farming became more specialized and intensive, the botanical diversity of pastures was reduced in favor of monoculture grasses that maximized milk production but minimized flavor complexity. The seasonal variations that had once created natural cycles of abundance and scarcity were smoothed out through improved feeding and breeding techniques, creating year-round milk supplies that eliminated the traditional rhythms of cheesemaking. The transformation was particularly dramatic in Britain, where the industrialization of cheese production proceeded with characteristic thoroughness. By the mid-20th century, cheddar had become 70% of all British cheese sales, not because consumers necessarily preferred it above all other varieties, but because it was the style best suited to mass production and long-distance distribution. Traditional British cheeses like Stilton, Cheshire, and Wensleydale survived, but often in standardized factory versions that bore little resemblance to their farmhouse origins. The Milk Marketing Board, established by the British government in 1933, accelerated this consolidation by actively discouraging small-scale farmhouse production in favor of centralized facilities that could process milk more efficiently. The board's policies were designed to stabilize milk prices and ensure consistent supply, but they also systematically undermined the economic viability of traditional cheesemaking. Farmers who might once have transformed their own milk into distinctive local cheeses found it more profitable to sell to large processors who turned it into standardized products for national distribution. I remember the irony that this period of standardization coincided with dramatic improvements in transportation and refrigeration technology that theoretically should have made it easier to distribute diverse artisanal products to wider markets. Railroads, steamships, and eventually refrigerated trucks could have carried traditional regional cheeses from remote farms to urban markets more efficiently than ever before. Instead, these same technologies were used primarily to support the distribution of mass-produced products that could take advantage of economies of scale. These practical constraints produced cheesemaking methods that were fundamentally different from sedentary traditions. Mongol cheeses were often dried into hard, concentrated forms that could be stored for months and reconstituted with hot water when needed. They were designed for portability and preservation rather than complex flavor development, reflecting a culture where survival took precedence over culinary sophistication. The contrast with Chinese dairy traditions, were rather the notable absence of such traditions, reveals how cultural attitudes towards specific foods can shape entire culinary landscapes. In traditional Han Chinese culture, dairy products were associated with the nomadic peoples who lived on China's borders, groups that were often viewed with suspicion or hostility. Milk and cheese carried cultural connotations of barbarism and foreignness that made them unappealing to populations that prided themselves on agricultural sophistication and urban refinement. But the cultural resistance to dairy was reinforced by biological reality. The majority of Han Chinese populations were lactose intolerant, lacking the genetic mutations that had allowed certain European and Central Asian populations to digest milk into adulthood. For most Chinese people, consuming fresh milk would have caused significant digestive discomfort, making dairy products seem not just culturally foreign but physically problematic. Yet even within China's vast territory, exceptions existed that proved the rule. In Yunnan province, ethnic minorities maintained their own cheesemaking traditions that reflected their distinct cultural identities and historical connections to Central Asian nomadic traditions. Rubin, a fresh goat cheese often compared to Indian paneer, and Russian, consisting of thin strips of cow's milk cheese that were dried and then fried, represented isolated pockets of dairy culture within a civilization that had otherwise rejected such foods. These minority traditions existed in a kind of cultural isolation, practiced by communities that maintained their distinct identities, despite political incorporation into the Chinese Empire. Their persistence demonstrates how food traditions can survive even when they conflict with dominant cultural attitudes, preserved by communities that value their distinctiveness and resist assimilation into mainstream practices. The geographical distribution of global cheese traditions reveals fascinating patterns that reflect the complex interaction of climate, culture, biology, and history. Dairy-based cuisines developed most successfully in temperate regions with suitable grazing, lands, and climates that favored food preservation. They flourished among populations that had developed lactose tolerance and cultural frameworks that encouraged experimentation with fermented foods. But within these broad patterns, remarkable diversity emerged as different cultures adapted basic cheese-making principles to their specific needs, resources, and values. The fresh, acid-curdled cheeses of India reflected religious values and tropical climates that favored immediate consumption. The hard, portable cheeses of Mongolia reflected nomadic lifestyles and extreme preservation needs. The minority traditions of China reflected the complex ways that cultural practices could persist in isolated communities. Despite broader cultural rejection, I remember the African continent's own diverse dairy traditions, often centered around nomadic herding communities that developed their own approaches to milk preservation and consumption. Cheeses like Ethiopia's AIB and Benin's Wagashi reflected local conditions and cultural preferences, often emphasizing fresh consumption and simple production, techniques that could be managed by mobile communities with limited equipment. These African traditions remained largely unchanged by European colonial influence, representing indigenous developments that paralleled but differed from the techniques introduced by European settlers. They demonstrated once again that the basic human need to preserve and transform milk was universal, even if the specific solutions varied dramatically based on local conditions and cultural constraints. The Americas presented yet another pattern where indigenous populations had developed sophisticated food preservation techniques for other products but had no dairy animals and therefore no cheese traditions before European colonization. The introduction of cattle, sheep, and goats by Spanish conquistadors brought new possibilities, but also cultural disruption that made the development of distinctive American cheese traditions a complex process of adaptation and innovation. Mexican queso cotija, for example, represented the successful fusion of Spanish techniques with Mexican conditions and preferences. Developed in the Sierra Jomich region over approximately 400 years, it reflected the adaptation of European hard cheese techniques to local milk sources, climate conditions, and cultural tastes. The result was a cheese that was distinctly Mexican while maintaining clear connections to its Spanish origins. The global diversity of cheese traditions reveals the remarkable adaptability of human culture and the universal nature of certain fundamental needs across vast distances and dramatically different environments. Human communities independently discovered that milk could be transformed into more stable, nutritious, and flavorful forms through various processes of coagulation, separation, and preservation. Yet the specific forms these discoveries took reflected the infinite creativity of human adaptation to local conditions, religious values, climate constraints, available resources, cultural preferences, and biological capabilities, all influenced how different societies approached the basic challenge of dairy preservation, producing a magnificent diversity of solutions that enriched the global culinary landscape while serving the practical needs of their communities. I remember the monsoon rains drumming against the thatched roofs of Indian villages, how the sound seemed to wash the air clean, while kitchens filled with the gentle hiss of milk curdling in clay pots. Here, thousands of miles from the cheese caves of France or the alpine meadows of Switzerland, another ancient tradition was unfolding, one that solved the same fundamental challenges of preservation and nutrition through entirely different cultural and religious pathways. The story of Paneer, India's beloved fresh cheese, reveals how universal human needs can produce remarkably similar solutions across vastly different civilizations. Like the accidental discoveries of the desert merchant or the systematic innovations of Roman military suppliers, paneer emerged from the intersection of practical necessity and cultural constraint. But where European cheesemaking embraced the transformative power of aging and bacterial cultures, Indian traditions focused on immediate consumption and religious purity. The origins of paneer remain debated among food historians, reflecting the complex ways that culinary knowledge travels across cultures and centuries. One theory traces its introduction to the 16th or 17th centuries, brought to India by Portuguese traders or Persian rulers who carried their own dairy traditions into the subcontinent. Another suggests much deeper roots, connecting paneer to ancient techniques that may have developed independently within the Indus Valley civilization thousands of years ago. What is certain is that paneer solved a uniquely Indian challenge: how to transform milk into a stable, protein-rich food while respecting religious prohibitions against spoiling the sacred gift of cow's milk. Traditional European cheesemaking relied heavily on rennet extracted from animal stomach linings, but this approach conflicted with Hindu principles that regarded cows as sacred animals whose products should not be contaminated with substances derived from slaughter. Indian cheesemakers developed an elegant alternative, using citric acid from fresh lime juice, vinegar, or other plant-based acids to trigger coagulation. The process was simpler than European methods. Heat fresh milk, add acid, strain the resulting curds, press them briefly to remove excess whey, but it required careful timing and temperature control to achieve the proper texture. Too much heat or acid would make the cheese tough and rubbery. Too little would prevent proper curd formation. The religious dimensions of Indian cheesemaking extended beyond the choice of coagulating agents. The entire process was embedded within cultural frameworks that emphasized purity, freshness, and the immediate consumption of dairy products. Unlike European traditions that celebrated the transformation of milk through aging, Indian approaches sought to preserve milk's essential character while making it more versatile and stable for cooking. I remember the contrast between the bustling immediacy of Indian paneer production and the patient, contemplative aging processes of European monasteries, where European cheesemakers measured success in months or years of careful aging. Indian cooks measured it in hours, the time needed to transform morning milk into fresh curds that could be added to evening curry. The philosophy was fundamentally different: transformation through time versus transformation through technique. But India was not the only Asian culture to develop distinctive dairy traditions. Far to the north, in the high plateaus of Mongolia, another ancient cheese tradition had evolved in response to the harsh realities of nomadic life and extreme climate. Recent archaeological discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of these traditions, revealing dairy consumption practices that stretch back over 5,000 years. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: dental calculus preserved in the permafrost of elite Mongol-era cemetery sites. When scientists analyzed these ancient dental deposits using advanced biochemical techniques, they found direct evidence of yak milk consumption among the ruling classes of medieval Mongolia. The proteins and fats trapped in fossilized plaque provided a molecular record of dietary practices that had previously existed only in fragmentary historical accounts. This discovery was remarkable not just for what it revealed about Mongol dairy consumption, but for how it demonstrated the sophisticated preservation qualities of Mongolia's extreme climate. The same conditions that made life difficult for the living had perfectly preserved biochemical evidence that allowed modern researchers to reconstruct ancient dietary practices with unprecedented accuracy. Mongolian cheese traditions reflected the practical needs of nomadic herders who had to make the most of limited resources while constantly moving across vast landscapes. Yak milk, richer and more nutritious than cow's milk, due to the animal's adaptation to high altitude and harsh conditions, was transformed into portable, long-lasting cheeses that could sustain families during long migrations and harsh winters. The techniques developed by Mongol cheesemakers were adapted to the realities of nomadic life. Cheeses had to be made quickly, without elaborate equipment or permanent facilities. They had to withstand temperature extremes and rough handling during transport. Most importantly, they had to provide maximum nutritional value from minimal resources, helping nomadic communities survive in environments where alternative protein sources were scarce and seasonal. Similar stories played out across the European landscape as local communities discovered how to work with their unique environmental conditions to create distinctive cheeses. In the caves of northern Italy, Gorgonzola developed its characteristic blue veining through a different species of penicillium that thrived in the specific humidity and temperature conditions of Po Valley aging facilities. In the alpine regions of Switzerland, the bacteria responsible for the holes in Emmentaler evolved in wooden aging rooms, where generations of cheesemakers had unknowingly cultivated the exact microbial communities needed to produce the gas bubbles that create the cheese's distinctive appearance. Each of these regional traditions represented centuries of trial and error, of gradual adaptation between human techniques and natural conditions. The cheesemakers didn't understand the microbiology behind their success, but they learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a batch was developing properly. They knew when to turn wheels, when to wash rinds, when to adjust temperature or humidity based on observations that had been passed down through generations of practical experience. I remember the seasonal rhythms that governed traditional European cheesemaking, how the characteristics of milk changed throughout the year, and how skilled cheesemakers adapted their techniques accordingly. Spring milk, from animals grazing on young grass rich with wildflowers and herbs, produced cheeses with bright, complex flavors that reflected the botanical diversity of their pastures. Summer milk, more concentrated due to reduced water content in mature grasses, created cheeses with deeper, more intense characteristics. Fall milk, from animals preparing for winter, had higher fat content that produced richer, more luxurious textures. These seasonal variations were not problems to be solved, but opportunities to be embraced. Traditional cheesemakers learned to create different varieties at different times of year, matching their techniques to the characteristics of available milk and environmental conditions. They understood that attempting to fight these natural cycles would produce inferior results, while working with them could create cheeses of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The concept of terroir also extended to the human element in cheesemaking. Different regions developed different cultural approaches to aging, handling, and finishing cheese based on local preferences, available materials, and inherited traditions. In some areas, cheeses were aged on wooden shelves that imparted subtle flavors from local hardwoods. In others, they were aged on stone shelves that provided different temperature and humidity characteristics. Some regions developed traditions of washing rinds with local wines, beers, or spirits, creating flavor profiles that reflected not just the natural environment, but the cultural landscape of their origins. The tools and equipment used in traditional cheesemaking also carried the signature of their regions. Wooden aging boards made from local timber harbored specific bacterial communities that influenced flavor development. Stone aging caves carved from regional limestone or granite provided unique mineral influences that affected both the chemistry and microbiology of aging cheese. Even the water used in production carried dissolved minerals that reflected local geology, subtly influencing everything from curd formation to rind development. But terroir was fragile in ways that its practitioners were only beginning to understand. The microbial communities that made regional cheeses possible could be disrupted by changes in agricultural practices, pollution, or climate. The introduction of new farming techniques, fertilizers, or pesticides could alter the bacterial populations in pastures and milk. Urban development could change local weather patterns or introduce new sources of contamination. Industrial agriculture could eliminate the botanical diversity that gave traditional cheeses their complex flavor profiles. The increasing centralization of milk production posed another threat to traditional terroir. When cheese was made from milk that was collected from hundreds of different farms and blended in large tanks, the distinctive characteristics of individual locations were averaged out and lost. The unique signature of a particular pasture or herd became invisible when mixed with milk from dozens of other sources. Modern transportation and refrigeration made this kind of centralization possible. But it came at the cost of the regional distinctiveness that had defined European cheese traditions for centuries. Some cheesemakers began to recognize that preserving terroir required more than just maintaining traditional techniques. It required preserving the entire ecosystem that made those techniques possible. This meant protecting not just specific aging facilities or production methods, but the pastures, water sources, and microbial communities that provided the raw materials for terroir-driven cheese production. It meant understanding that authentic regional cheese was not just a matter of following traditional recipes, but of maintaining the complex web of relationships between landscape, climate, plants, animals, and human culture that had evolved over centuries of local adaptation. I remember the morning mist that clung to alpine meadows, how it carried the scent of wild herbs and mountain flowers down into the valleys, where Swiss cheesemakers had learned to capture the very essence of their landscape in wheels of aged. There was something almost mystical about watching a master cheesemaker taste milk and predict, with uncanny accuracy, what kind of cheese it would become. He could sense things invisible to the untrained palate. The subtle differences that came from cows grazing on south-facing slopes versus north-facing ones, from spring grass versus autumn herbs, from limestone soils versus granite ones. This was terroir at work, that untranslatable French concept that suggests a food's character is inseparable from the place where it was created. While the word is most commonly associated with wine, its influence on cheese is equally profound and perhaps more mysterious. A wheel of cheese made from identical recipes in different locations will develop different flavors, different textures, different personalities that reflect the invisible fingerprint of their origins. The science behind terroir operates at levels both microscopic and atmospheric. Every region, every farm, every aging cave harbors its own unique community of bacteria, yeasts, and molds that exist nowhere else in quite the same combination. These microorganisms, invisible to the naked eye, but enormously powerful in their effects, colonize fresh cheese and guide its transformation during aging. They are influenced by everything from the mineral content of local water to the plants that grow in nearby fields, from the humidity patterns of seasonal weather to the construction materials of aging facilities. But terroir begins even before the milk reaches the cheesemaker's hands. It starts in the pastures where animals graze, with soils that have been shaped by millennia of geological processes, climates that create unique growing conditions, and plant communities that have evolved in response to local conditions. A cow grazing on herbs that grow only in alpine meadows will produce milk with subtle flavor compounds that differ from milk produced by her sister grazing in lowland pastures just a few miles away. I remember trying to understand how these invisible influences could create such dramatic differences in the final product. The answer lay partially in the complex chemistry of milk itself, which varies not just from animal to animal, but from season to season, from pasture to pasture, even from morning to evening. The proteins, fats, minerals, and enzymes that make up milk are all influenced by what the animal eats, drinks, and breathes. These variations, often too subtle to detect in fresh milk, become amplified and concentrated during the aging process, until they create the distinctive signatures that define regional cheese traditions. Raw milk cheese represents the ultimate expression of terroir, because it preserves all the natural bacteria and enzymes that pasteurization would destroy. These microorganisms carry the biological signature of their environment, the bacteria that live on local plants, in local soils, in the air of local aging facilities. When raw milk is transformed into cheese, these organisms continue to live and work, creating flavors and textures that are literally impossible to replicate anywhere else. The French have perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of terroir's role in cheesemaking, developed over centuries of observation and refinement. Their system of appellation d'origine, control designation of origin, recognizes that certain cheeses can only be authentic when produced in specific geographic areas using traditional methods. Roquefort, for instance, can only be called Roquefort if it's made from sheep's milk and aged in the natural caves of the Roquefort-sur-Saulçon commune in southern France. These caves, carved from limestone cliffs by underground streams, provide aging conditions that exist nowhere else on Earth. The temperature remains constant year-round at around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity hovers between 95 and 98%, creating the perfect environment for Penicillium roqueforti, the blue-green mold that gives Roquefort its characteristic veining and pungent flavor. The caves breathe with the seasons, drawing air through networks of natural fissures that regulate airflow and introduce the specific microorganisms that make authentic Roquefort possible. The makers of Roquefort learned to work with these natural conditions rather than trying to control them completely. They understood that the mold would behave differently at different times of year, that the aging process would vary with seasonal changes in temperature and humidity, that each wheel would develop its own personality while sharing the fundamental characteristics that defined the style. This partnership between human skill and natural environment created cheeses that were both consistent enough to maintain their identity and variable enough to express the subtle influences of season, weather, and individual batch variations. The result was a cheese of extraordinary complexity and intensity, one that could only have been created by people who had the time, knowledge, and dedication to perfect such an elaborate process. The monastic contribution to cheese development extended far beyond individual varieties. The monks systematically explored the possibilities of different milk combinations, discovering that blending cow, sheep, and goat milk in various proportions could produce textures and flavors that none of these milks could achieve alone. They experimented with different sources of rennet, finding that rennet from different animals or different parts of the stomach could subtly alter the final product. They developed new methods for controlling acidity, temperature, and aging environments that allowed them to create cheeses with characteristics that had never existed before. Perhaps most importantly, the monasteries served as repositories of knowledge during periods when secular society was often too chaotic or impoverished to support such systematic experimentation. The monks maintained detailed records of their procedures, passed knowledge down through generations of novices, and shared techniques with other monastic communities through the networks of religious orders that connected monasteries across Europe. When political upheavals disrupted secular cheesemaking traditions, the monastic versions often survived to seed new developments when stability returned. I remember the seasonal rhythms that governed monastic cheesemaking, how the agricultural calendar shaped not just what was produced, but when and how it was made. Spring brought the abundance of fresh milk from animals that had wintered on stored fodder, and were now grazing on new grass rich with herbs and wildflowers. This was the season for creating the cheeses that would age throughout the summer and fall, developing the complex flavors that made them suitable for special occasions and religious feasts. Summer required constant attention to aging cheeses, as the warm weather could either perfect or ruin months of careful work. Monks made daily rounds through their cellars, turning wheels, adjusting humidity, monitoring the development of rinds and the progression of flavors. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a cheese was aging properly or developing problems that needed immediate intervention. Fall was the time for creating the cheeses that would sustain the community through the winter months ahead. The monks had learned that cheeses made with late-season milk from animals that had grazed on autumn grasses and herbs often developed different characteristics than those made earlier in the year. They adjusted their techniques accordingly, creating harder cheeses with longer aging potential when they needed products that would remain stable for many months. Winter was the season for consuming the results of the year's work, when the success or failure of different experimental approaches became clear, but it was also a time for planning and preparation, for maintaining equipment and experimenting with new techniques that could be implemented when milk production resumed in earnest, with the arrival of spring. The monastic approach to cheesemaking was fundamentally different from the commercial approaches that had characterized Roman production or would later define industrial methods. The monks were not primarily concerned with efficiency, standardization, or profit maximization. Instead, they pursued what we might call perfection, the creation of products that expressed the full potential of their ingredients and methods, regardless of the time and effort required. This pursuit of excellence rather than efficiency led to innovations that would have been impossible under commercial constraints. Monks could afford to age cheeses for years if necessary to achieve the desired characteristics. They could discard batches that didn't meet their standards rather than selling inferior products. Most importantly, they could invest the time needed to truly understand their craft, developing the kind of intuitive knowledge that comes only from patient observation and systematic experimentation. The legacy of monastic cheesemaking extends far beyond the specific varieties that monks created. But perhaps most importantly, the monks demonstrated that cheesemaking could be more than just food production. In their hands, it became a form of spiritual practice, a way of participating in the divine work of creation through the transformation of simple ingredients into something complex, beautiful, and nourishing. They showed that patience, attention, and reverence for natural processes could produce results that mere technical skill could never achieve. I remember the sound of monastery bells drifting across the valleys of medieval Europe, how their bronze voices marked the hours of prayer and work that shaped monastic life. But beneath those familiar rhythms lay another sound, quieter but no less important. The soft splash of whey draining through reed baskets, the gentle scraping of curds being turned and pressed, the patient footsteps of monks making their daily rounds through cheese cellars that had become, almost by accident, laboratories of culinary innovation. The fall of Rome had shattered the organized systems that once fed the empire's armies and cities. Trade routes became dangerous, standardized production collapsed, and much of the technical knowledge that Roman cheesemakers had accumulated over centuries seemed destined to disappear with the civilization that had created it. But in the scattered monasteries that dotted the European countryside, something remarkable was happening. Communities of monks and nuns were not just preserving ancient knowledge, they were improving it, refining it, and creating entirely new traditions that would outlast the empires and kingdoms that rose and fell around them. The monastic focus on cheesemaking was born from both spiritual and practical necessities. The Christian calendar imposed lengthy periods of fasting when the consumption of meat and fish was forbidden to the faithful. During these times, which could last for months, cheese became a crucial source of protein that allowed religious communities to maintain their strength while observing their spiritual disciplines. Unlike meat, which was clearly prohibited during fasting periods, cheese occupied a more ambiguous position in religious law. It was made from milk, not flesh, and the process of aging transformed it into something that seemed fundamentally different from its animal origins. But beyond the requirements of religious observance, monasteries faced the same practical challenges that had always driven innovation in food preservation. These communities were designed to be self-sufficient, producing everything they needed to survive within their own walls and surrounding lands. They maintained herds of cattle, sheep, and goats that provided milk in seasonal abundance. Without reliable methods of preservation, much of this valuable resource would have been wasted during periods of peak production, leaving the communities vulnerable during leaner times. The disciplined, contemplative nature of monastic life proved ideally suited to the patient work that excellent cheesemaking required. Unlike farmers or herders who had to divide their attention among many different tasks, monks could dedicate themselves to understanding every aspect of the cheesemaking process. They had the time to experiment with different techniques, to observe subtle variations in results, and to maintain the detailed records that allowed successful innovations to be preserved and refined over generations. I remember imagining those early monastic cheesemakers working by candlelight in stone cellars that stayed cool even during the hottest summer days. They would have noticed how different bacterial cultures produced different flavors and textures, though they wouldn't have understood the microbiology behind these variations. They observed how the humidity and temperature of aging environments affected the development of rinds and the concentration of flavors. Most importantly, they had the patience to age cheeses for much longer periods than most secular producers could afford, discovering that time itself could be an ingredient in creating complexity and depth. The monks also had access to ingredients and techniques that were not available to ordinary cheesemakers. Many monasteries produced beer and wine as part of their self-sufficient operations, and the byproducts of these processes spent grains, wine, lees, and the alcohol itself could be incorporated into cheese production in innovative ways. The practice of washing cheese rinds with beer or wine, which became fundamental to many monastic cheese traditions, may have developed from the simple availability of these liquids and the monks' willingness to experiment with their effects. One of the most famous examples of monastic cheese innovation is Munster, which takes its very name from the Latin word for monastery. First created by Benedictine monks in Germany in 1371, Munster exemplified the monastic approach to cheesemaking. The monks developed techniques for washing the cheese's rind with brine during the aging process, a procedure that encouraged the growth of specific bacteria that gave the cheese its distinctive orange color and pungent aroma. The process required careful attention and regular maintenance over several months, exactly the kind of patient, methodical work that suited monastic life. The Cistercian monastery of Epoisses in Burgundy created another legendary cheese that would eventually earn Napoleon's declaration. As the king of all cheeses, the monks there developed a complex aging process that involved regular washing with Marc de Bourgogne, the local pumice brandy, combined with careful control of humidity and temperature in natural stone cellars. The military's demand for reliable cheese supplies created powerful incentives for innovation and expansion in civilian cheesemaking. Roman entrepreneurs who could meet military contracts stood to make substantial profits, but they also had to meet exacting standards for quality and consistency. Military purchasers couldn't accept cheese that varied significantly from batch to batch, because such variation could affect the nutritional content and storage life that soldiers depended on. This drove the development of increasingly sophisticated production techniques and quality control measures. Roman cheesemakers learned to test their products systematically, to maintain detailed records of their procedures, and to standardize their operations in ways that would ensure predictable results. They developed better methods for controlling temperature and humidity during aging, more reliable sources of high quality, rennet, and improved packaging techniques that would protect cheese during long-distance transport. The knowledge and techniques developed for military purposes inevitably spread into civilian markets. Urban populations throughout the empire developed tastes for the standardized cheeses that military contractors produced, creating demand that extended far beyond the army's requirements. Roman trade networks carried cheese varieties from one end of the empire to the other, introducing local populations to flavors and textures they had never experienced before. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Roman military cheese production was not economic, but cultural. When legionnaires completed their service and settled in conquered territories, they brought with them not just their languages and customs, but their knowledge of cheesemaking techniques. Retired soldiers who had spent years eating standardized military cheese often had learned enough about its production to start their own operations, adapting Roman methods to local conditions and preferences. This is how Roman cheesemaking spread to Gaul, where it would eventually evolve into the French cheese traditions that still define that country's culinary identity. Roman techniques reached Britain, where they merged with local practices to create distinctive regional varieties. In every province where Roman legions established permanent camps, some version of Roman cheese production took root and began the long process of adaptation and evolution that would eventually produce the rich diversity of European cheese traditions. The process was not always smooth or direct. Local climates, available milk sources, and cultural preferences all influenced how Roman techniques were modified and implemented. The hard-aged cheeses that worked well for military rations were not necessarily what civilian populations preferred for daily consumption. Local cheesemakers experimented with different aging periods, different milk combinations, and different flavor additions until they found products that satisfied local tastes while maintaining the preservation qualities that made cheese valuable in the first place. I remember the irony that military efficiency, designed to support conquest and control, ended up becoming a force for cultural diversity and local adaptation. The standardized techniques that allowed the Roman army to feed itself consistently across the empire became the foundation for countless regional variations that expressed the unique character of different landscapes, climates, and communities. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century did not erase this legacy. The knowledge that Roman soldiers had carried to distant provinces survived in the hands of local populations who had learned to value cheese for reasons that went beyond military necessity. They understood that cheese was not just preserved milk, but a way of transforming seasonal abundance into year-round security, local resources into trade goods, simple ingredients into complex flavors that could define the character of a place and its people. The Roman approach to cheese systematic, standardized, scaled for large-scale distribution, would eventually be rediscovered and refined during the Industrial Revolution. But in the centuries immediately following the empire's collapse, cheese production returned to smaller scales and more localized methods. Monasteries, manor houses, and farm communities took over the work that Roman military contractors had once performed, adapting imperial techniques to medieval conditions and priorities. Yet the fundamental lesson of Roman cheese production remained, that food, preservation, and distribution could be organized systematically, that standardization and quality control were possible even with ancient technology, and that the ability to feed large populations reliably was itself a form of power. The legions that conquered the Mediterranean world did so with bronze weapons and iron discipline, but they also did so with daily rations of aged cheese that kept them strong enough to march, fight, and build the infrastructure that would outlast their empire by 1,000 years. The Roman approach to cheese systematic, standardized, scaled for large-scale distribution, would eventually be rediscovered and refined during the Industrial Revolution. But in the centuries immediately following the empire's collapse, cheese production returned to smaller scales and more localized methods. I remember the sound of 10,000 sandaled feet striking the cobblestones at dawn, how the rhythm of a Roman legion on the march could be heard for miles across the countryside, but beneath that martial thunder lay a quieter sound that few outside the army would have recognized. The soft rustle of leather pouches containing each soldier's daily cheese ration, 27 grams of hard-aged Pecorino Romano that would sustain him through whatever lay ahead. The Roman Empire was built on many foundation-superior organizations, disciplined troops, innovative engineering, but one of its least celebrated pillars was cheese. While poets sang of eagles and glory, while historians recorded the grand strategies of generals and emperors, the actual business of conquest depended on something far more mundane, the ability to feed enormous numbers of soldiers across vast distances for months or years at a time. Fresh meat spoiled within days. Bread, while portable, required constant baking and could grow moldy in damp conditions. Vegetables were seasonal and regional, but cheese properly made, carefully aged, and packed in sealed containers could last for months without refrigeration, while providing the concentrated protein and fat that hard-working soldiers needed to maintain their strength and fighting effectiveness. The Romans approached this challenge with the same systematic efficiency they brought to road building and territorial administration. They didn't just adopt existing cheesemaking techniques, they industrialized them, standardized them, and scaled them up to meet the demands of an empire that stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Euphrates River. Roman cheese production centered around specialized facilities called castle-dedicated cheese kitchens that were separate from ordinary cooking areas. These weren't the small-scale operations of individual farmers or herders, but organized workshops where teams of skilled workers could process large quantities of milk according to standardized procedures. The Romans had learned that consistency in cheese production required consistency in methods, and consistency in methods required dedicated spaces designed specifically for the purpose. The castle contained separate areas for different stages of the cheese-making process. Fresh milk was heated in large copper vats over carefully controlled fires. Rennet, extracted from the stomach linings of young calves, was added according to precise measurements that had been refined through generations of military provisioning. The resulting curds were drained through woven baskets, pressed in wooden forms, and then moved to specially constructed aging rooms, where they could develop the hard rinds and intense flavors that made them suitable for long-term storage. By the 1st century of the Christian era, Roman cheesemakers had developed more than 20 distinct varieties, each suited to different purposes and preferences. Some were soft and meant for immediate consumption. Others were aged for months or even years until they achieved the rock-hard consistency and concentrated flavor that made them ideal military rations. The Romans had learned to manipulate every variable in the cheese-making process: the type of milk used, the source and amount of rennet, the temperature and humidity of aging environments, the length of the aging period to produce exactly the characteristics they wanted. But their most important innovation was not technical but logistical. The Roman military created the first large-scale distribution network for preserved foods, a system that could reliably deliver standardized cheese rations to legions stationed anywhere in the known world. This required not just efficient production, but careful inventory management, quality control, and transportation infrastructure that could maintain the integrity of the product across thousands of miles and many months of storage. I remember trying to imagine the scale of this operation. A single legion contained roughly 5,000 soldiers, each receiving his daily cheese ration. A major military campaign might involve multiple legions operating for an entire campaigning season. The cheese requirements alone would have demanded the milk production of thousands of cattle, sheep, and goats, all coordinated through supply chains that stretched across provinces and maritime routes. The soldiers themselves developed a complex relationship with their cheese rations. On one hand, the daily portion of pecorino romano was a lifeline, a reliable source of nutrition that could mean the difference between strength and weakness, victory and defeat. Soldiers knew that armies with better supply lines generally won battles against armies that were hungry, tired, or weakened by poor nutrition. On the other hand, military cheese was not a luxury item. It was hard, salty, and monotonous, designed for nutrition and preservation rather than culinary pleasure. Soldiers complained about it in their letters home, joked about it around their campfires, and probably dreamed of the softer, fresher cheeses they had known in civilian life. But they ate it faithfully because they understood its importance to their survival and their effectiveness as fighting men. Yet for all its sophistication, feta production remained associated with rural life, with shepherds who moved their flocks between summer and winter pastures, living in temporary shelters and working with tools that hadn't changed much since Homer's time. The cheese that graced the tables of wealthy Athenians was made by people whose lives were as remote from urban sophistication as Polyphemus's cave was from Mount Olympus. This cultural tension extended beyond the practical aspects of cheesemaking into the realm of philosophy and social identity. The Greeks prided themselves on their rationality, their ability to understand and explain natural phenomena through reason rather than superstition. Yet cheesemaking stubbornly resisted complete rational explanation. Even experienced cheesemakers couldn't always predict exactly how a batch would turn out. The invisible bacteria that drove fermentation, the subtle variations in milk composition, the effects of weather and season on aging, all of these factors operated beyond the reach of Greek scientific understanding. So they told stories that acknowledged both the mystery and the mundane reality of cheese production. Aristeas represented their aspiration to understand and control natural processes through divine knowledge. Polyphemus represented their awareness that such control was always partial, always dependent on forces that remained fundamentally wild and unpredictable. The geographic setting of these myths was not accidental. The Greek islands, with their sparse pastures and isolated communities, were natural laboratories for cheesemaking innovation. Sheep and goats thrived in the rocky, herb-covered landscapes where cattle could not survive. The maritime climate provided the humidity necessary for proper aging, while the sea salt that crystallized from evaporated spray could be harvested for brining and preservation. Each island developed its own variations and specialties, driven by local conditions and preferences. Some favored longer aging periods that produced harder, more intense flavors. Others preferred fresher cheeses that retained more of milk's original sweetness. The isolation that made island life challenging also protected local traditions from outside influence, allowing distinctive regional styles to develop and persist across generations. I remember the seasonal rhythms that governed Greek cheesemaking, how the availability of fresh milk ebbed and flowed with the reproductive cycles of the herds and the harsh realities of Mediterranean weather. Spring was the season of abundance, when ewes and goats produced their richest milk and cheesemakers worked frantically to transform the surplus into forms that would last through the lean months ahead. Summer brought the challenge of aging cheese in hot, dry conditions that could either perfect or ruin months of careful work. Winter was the time for consuming the stored wealth of previous seasons, when the success or failure of the year's cheesemaking efforts became clear. This seasonal cycle connected Greek cheesemakers to the larger rhythms of agricultural life, but it also set them apart. While grain farmers could predict their harvests with reasonable accuracy, and olive growers knew roughly what to expect from their groves, cheesemakers worked with a living product that could surprise them even after years of experience. A batch that seemed perfect during production might develop off flavors during aging. Weather conditions that had worked well in previous years might produce disappointing results due to subtle changes in humidity or temperature. The unpredictability of cheesemaking reinforced its association with both divine favor and primitive uncertainty. When a batch turned out exceptionally well, it seemed reasonable to credit the blessing of Aristeas. When it failed, despite careful attention to traditional methods, it was easy to blame the chaotic forces that Polyphemus represented, the wild, uncontrollable aspects of nature that even the most skilled human effort couldn't completely tame. This Greek understanding of cheesemaking as simultaneously divine and primitive, refined and rough, would echo through subsequent cultures that inherited their techniques and traditions. The Romans, who conquered Greek territories and absorbed much of their culture, would struggle with similar contradictions as they tried to systematize and industrialize processes that had developed through centuries of individual craftwork and local adaptation. But the Greeks gave us more than just techniques and contradictions. They gave us a way of thinking about food that acknowledged its cultural complexity, its ability to carry meanings that extend far beyond simple nutrition. In their myths and their practices, they recognized that cheese was never just cheese, was always also a statement about civilization and wildness, skill and luck, human ambition and natural limitation. This seasonal cycle connected Greek cheesemakers to the larger rhythms of agricultural life, but it also set them apart. While grain farmers could predict their harvests with reasonable accuracy, and olive growers knew roughly what to expect from their groves, cheesemakers worked with a living product that could surprise them even after years of experience. I remember the wind that swept across the Aegean islands, carrying with it the scent of wild thyme and sea salt, the kind of wind that seemed to whisper stories older than written memory. On the island of Naxos, where marble gleamed white against the endless blue of the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks believed that the god Aristeas first learned the sacred art of cheesemaking. From the nymphs who dwelt in hidden groves and secret springs, Aristeas was no ordinary deity, son of Apollo, god of light and prophecy. He governed the pastoral arts that kept humanity fed and clothed, beekeeping, olive cultivation, and the transformation of milk into cheese, according to the myths that mothers told their children by firelight. The nymphs of Naxos took pity on mortals who struggled to preserve the milk from their herds. They taught Aristeas the mystery of rennet, showed him how the stomach lining of a young lamb could work its invisible magic on fresh milk, turning liquid into solid, perishable into permanent. In this telling, cheesemaking was not an accident or a practical discovery born from necessity. It was a divine gift, a sacred knowledge passed down from the immortal realm to help humanity transcend the limitations of their mortal existence. The Greeks who told this story understood cheese as something elevated, refined, civilized, the symbol of human partnership with the divine order that governed the natural world. But Greek culture held another vision of cheesemaking, one that stood in stark contrast to the refined mythology of Aristeas in Homer's Odyssey, that great epic of wandering and homecoming that every educated Greek knew by heart. We encounter Polyphemus, the monstrous Cyclops who dwells in a cave on a remote island, tending his flocks of sheep and goats in brutal solitude. Homer describes the scene that Odysseus and his men discovered when they ventured into the giant's cave. Wheels of cheese stored in woven baskets, fresh curds draining in shallow bowls, the acrid smell of rennet and aging dairy hanging in the smoky air. Polyphemus was skilled in the cheesemaker's art, but there was nothing divine or civilized about his practice. He worked with his massive hands, pressing curds with casual violence, storing his wheels in the darkness of his primitive dwelling. The poet took care to describe the Cyclops' technique in detail. We see him milking his ewes and goats each morning and evening, setting aside half the milk for drinking and working the rest into cheese. He uses traditional methods, probably the same techniques that real Greek shepherds employed in their daily work, but in Homer's telling, these skills belong to a creature of savage appetite and limited intelligence, a being who represents everything uncivilized about the pastoral life. This duality, cheese as divine gift versus cheese as primitive. Necessity captures something essential about how the Greeks understood their own relationship with food, craft, and civilization. On one hand, they recognized that the ability to transform milk into cheese represented a kind of mastery over natural processes, a partnership with invisible forces that bordered on the magical, the careful timing required, the mysterious action of rennet. The slow alchemy of aging these seemed to require divine instruction, divine blessing. On the other hand, they knew that cheesemaking was fundamentally the work of shepherds, people who lived on the margins of civilized society. Far from the cities where philosophy and politics flourished, the actual labor of cheese production was rough, smelly, demanding work that kept people away from the centers of cultural refinement. Like Polyphemus, real cheesemakers lived in relative isolation, their hands permanently stained with whey, their clothes carrying the persistent odor of milk and rennet. I remember how this tension played out in the actual practice of Greek cheesemaking, which relied heavily on containers made from animal skins. The traditional tulimi bags, sewn from sheep or goat hides, with the hair left unserved as both churns and aging vessels for Greek cheese. These primitive-looking containers were actually sophisticated pieces of technology, their porous surfaces allowing just enough air exchange to promote proper aging while protecting the cheese from contamination. But the tulimi also embodied the paradox at the heart of Greek attitudes toward cheese. Here was a vessel that was simultaneously crude and refined, primitive in appearance but sophisticated in function. Like the Cyclops' cave, it represented the necessary but somewhat embarrassing reality that even the most elevated human achievements depended on processes that were fundamentally earthy, animal, and rough around the edges. The Greeks developed several varieties of cheese that would become foundational to Mediterranean cuisine. Feta, perhaps their most famous contribution to the world of cheese, emerged from this complex cultural relationship with dairy production, made primarily from sheep's milk, though sometimes blended with goat's milk. Feta was aged in briner technique that preserved the cheese while giving it its characteristic salty, tangy flavor and crumbly texture. The production of feta required considerable skill and patience. Cheesemakers had to achieve exactly the right balance of salt concentration in the brine to prevent spoilage while allowing the proper fermentation, to develop the cheese's distinctive taste. Too little salt and the cheese would rot. Too much and it would become inedibly salty. The technique demanded the kind of intuitive understanding that came only from years of experience and careful observation. The Egyptian cheesemakers developed sophisticated techniques that suggest they understood, even if they couldn't explain, many of the principles that modern food scientists have codified. They knew that certain milk combinations produced better results than others. They understood the importance of temperature control, timing, and proper drainage. They had learned to age cheese in cool, dry places that would slow spoilage and develop complex flavors. Most importantly, they had elevated cheesemaking from a practical necessity to an art form worthy of the most elite members of their society. The fact that cheese appeared not just in royal tombs, but in the tombs of high officials like Tommy's, suggests that by the late period of Egyptian history, fine cheese had become a marker of social status, a luxury that distinguished the wealthy from the common people, who might have to make do with simpler, less refined varieties. I remember trying to imagine the workshops where Egyptian cheesemakers perfected their craft, probably attached to the great temples and palaces where wealth and religious authority intersected. The master cheesemakers would have been skilled artisans, their knowledge passed down through generations of careful observation and patient experimentation. They would have known exactly when milk had reached the right temperature for curdling, exactly how much pressure to apply during pressing, exactly how long different varieties needed to age for optimal flavor and texture. These workshops would have been busy places during the flood season, when the Nile's annual inundation made fresh milk abundant and the need for preserved foods most urgent. Workers would have labored over fires that heated great vats of milk, stirring in the acidic substances that would trigger coagulation. The air would have been filled with the sharp, clean smell of fresh whey and the earthier aroma of aging curds. Finished wheels would have been stored in cool chambers carved into bedrock, where they could age safely away from the desert heat. The social organization required for this level of cheese production was considerable. Someone had to manage the herds that provided the milk. Others had to gather and prepare the acidic substances used for curdling. Skilled workers had to oversee the actual cheese production. Still others had to manage storage, aging, and distribution. The whole system required coordination, specialization, and the kind of hierarchical organization that could only exist in a complex society with sufficient agricultural surplus to support non-farming specialists. But beyond the practical and economic aspects, the Egyptian treatment of cheese reveals something profound about how human cultures invest simple foods with complex meanings, by painting cheese-making scenes in tombs, by including wheels of cheese among grave goods, by developing sophisticated production techniques worthy of the royal household. The Egyptians transformed a basic preservation method into an expression of cultural values. They were saying that cheese mattered not just because it prevented starvation, but because it represented human mastery over natural processes, the ability to transform the simple gift of milk into something more complex, more enduring, more worthy of the gods themselves. In their worldview, the skills needed to make fine cheese were important enough to carry into eternity, valuable enough to ensure their preservation through the most expensive and elaborate art their civilization could create. The cheese in Tom's tomb, despite its hidden dangers, represents this transformation perfectly. It was made with skill, prepared with care, and chosen for burial because it embodied something essential about Egyptian civilization's relationship with food, craft, and the afterlife. That it carried disease serves as a reminder that ancient peoples lived with risks we can barely imagine, but that they faced those risks with remarkable courage and ingenuity. Their legacy reaches us across more than 3,000 years, not just in the archaeological evidence they left behind, but in the fundamental techniques they helped develop and refine, the basic principles of Egyptian cheesemaking. The careful combination of different milks, the control of temperature and acidity, the patient aging in cool storage, these are still the foundation of artisanal cheese production today. The social organization required for this level of cheese production was considerable. Someone had to manage the herds that provided the milk. Others had to gather and prepare the acidic substances used for curdling. Skilled workers had to oversee the actual cheese production. Still others had to manage storage, aging, and distribution. The whole system required coordination, specialization, and the kind of hierarchical organization that could only exist in a complex society with sufficient agricultural surplus to support non-farming specialists. I remember the dusty silence of ancient tombs, how the air felt thick with centuries when archaeologists first broke through sealed doorways into chambers that had waited in darkness since the time of the pharaohs. The smell was unmistakable, not decay, exactly, but the deep, dry scent of time itself, of organic matter slowly surrendering to eternity. And there, among the golden treasures and carefully wrapped mummies, sat humble clay jars that would tell us one of cheese's most remarkable stories. The story begins not in Egypt, but in the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where humanity was learning to write, to build cities, to organize complex societies around agriculture and trade. The Sumerians, those patient record keepers of the ancient world, left us the first written evidence of cheese production in their meticulous administrative tablets. Dating to around 4,000 years before the Christian era, these cuneiform records mention cheese not as a curiosity or luxury, but as a standard commodity, something important enough to require careful accounting. In those tablets, pressed into clay by scribes, working by oil lamp light, cheese appears alongside grain, textiles, and livestock in the inventories of temples and palaces. The scribes recorded cheese quotas, cheese distributions, cheese offerings to the gods. This wasn't just food, it was currency, a form of wealth that could be stored, traded, and offered in religious rituals. The very fact that they bothered to record it so systematically tells us that cheese had already become integral to their economic and spiritual lives. But it was in Egypt where cheese found its most dramatic ancient expression. Egyptian tomb murals from around 2300 years before Christ show us the actual process in vivid detail. Artists painted scene after scene of workers straining milk through red mats, pressing curds in wooden forms, and storing finished wheels in cool chambers. These weren't quick sketches or symbolic representations. They were instruction manuals, painted with the kind of precision that suggests the artists had watched the process many times, understood its importance, and wanted to ensure it could be recreated in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that death was not an ending but a transition, and that the deceased would need all the skills and comforts of earthly life in their journey through eternity. By painting cheesemaking scenes on tomb walls, they were ensuring that pharaohs and nobles would be able to enjoy fresh cheese in whatever realm awaited them. The paintings show every step of the process: the careful heating of milk, the addition of what was probably fig juice or other acidic substances to cause curdling, the patient straining through woven baskets, and finally the pressing and aging of the finished product. These murals reveal something profound about how the Egyptians viewed cheese. It wasn't simply sustenance, it was sophisticated enough, valuable enough, and culturally significant enough to merit a place in the most sacred and expensive art they created. The tomb painters lavished the same attention on cheesemaking scenes that they gave to depictions of royal hunts, religious ceremonies, and military victories. I remember the moment when archaeologists working in the tomb of Ptolemys, a high-ranking Egyptian official from the 13th century before Christ, made one of the most remarkable cheese discoveries in archaeological history. Among the broken pottery and scattered grave goods, they found what looked like nothing more than a solidified whitish mass on several jar fragments. For decades, it sat in storage, just another curiosity from an ancient burial site. But modern science has ways of extracting secrets from even the most unlikely sources. When researchers finally subjected those ancient white fragments to biochemical analysis, they confirmed what they had hardly dared to hope. This was cheese, the oldest solid cheese residue ever discovered and analyzed. The tests revealed that it had been made from a mixture of cow, sheep, and goat milk, a sophisticated blend that suggests Egyptian cheesemakers had already learned to combine different milk sources for specific flavor and texture effects. The discovery was thrilling, but it also carried a sobering lesson about the hidden dangers of ancient food production. Further analysis revealed traces of Brucella melitensis, the bacteria responsible for brucellosis, a serious infectious disease that can cause fever, severe gastrointestinal distress, and long-term health complications. This ancient cheese, prepared for a member of the Egyptian elite and deemed worthy of burial with the dead, carried within it a potentially deadly pathogen. The presence of brucellosis bacteria in Tom's cheese offers us a chilling glimpse into the reality of pre-pasteurization, dairy production. Every wheel of ancient cheese was a gamble, a delicious but potentially dangerous food that could nourish or sicken depending on factors the cheesemakers couldn't see or control. The bacteria that transformed milk into cheese could also harbor invisible enemies that would strike without warning, turning a source of sustenance into a source of suffering. Yet the Egyptians continued to make and value cheese, because the benefits outweighed the risks in their calculation of survival. In a world where food preservation was a constant challenge, where a failed harvest could mean death, where armies needed provisions that wouldn't spoil on long campaigns, cheese represented security despite its dangers. It was a food that could survive the flooding of the Nile, the heat of desert trade routes, and the passage of months or even years in storage. The implications rippled outward in ways those first cheesemakers could never have imagined. Communities that mastered cheese production could support larger populations, survive harsh winters more easily, and undertake longer journeys. They could trade surplus cheese for other goods, creating the foundation for more complex economies. They could feed specialized craftspeople who weren't involved in food production, enabling the development of pottery, metalworking, and other technologies. I remember trying to imagine what that first successful batch of cheese must have meant to the person who made it. The relief of discovering that this strange, solid substance was not only edible, but actually quite pleasant to taste. The gradual realization that it didn't spoil like fresh milk did. The moment when someone thought to try different variations, different sources of acid, different straining techniques, different aging conditions, discovered that the basic process could yield an almost infinite variety of results. But perhaps most remarkably, this discovery was not unique to that Polish settlement. Archaeological evidence suggests that cheese production emerged independently in multiple locations across the ancient world, as if the solution to the lactose problem was so logical, so necessary, that it was inevitable. Each community that kept dairy animals and faced the challenge of milk intolerance seems to have found its own path to the same solution. The chemistry behind their success was elegantly simple, though they couldn't have known it at the time. Milk is essentially a suspension of proteins and fats in water, held stable by the specific pH and temperature conditions inside a healthy animal. Change those conditions, make the milk more acidic, heat it, or introduce certain enzymes, then the proteins lose their stability. They begin to clump together, forming larger and larger aggregations, until they're big enough to be captured by even a simple strainer. The enzyme most commonly responsible for this transformation is rennet, found naturally in the stomach lining of young mammals. If you stored milk in a pouch made from a calf's or lamb's stomach, as many herding peoples did, the rennet would slowly work on the milk proteins, causing them to coagulate. This may have been how the process was first discovered, not through deliberate experimentation, but through the practical necessities of milk storage and transport. Those Polish pottery shards represent more than just an archaeological curiosity. They're evidence of one of humanity's most important technological innovations, a solution to a biological problem that opened up entirely new possibilities for human settlement and development. They marked the moment when we learned that food could be not just gathered or hunted, but actively transformed when we became not just consumers of nature's bounty, but partners in its creation. The knowledge preserved in those perforated bowls would spread slowly across the ancient world, carried by traders, migrants, and nomadic herders. It would be refined and perfected by countless generations of cheesemakers, each adding their own innovations to the basic process. It would survive the rise and fall of empires, the development of new technologies, the transformation of human society from small farming villages to vast industrial cities. And it all began with those simple, purposeful holes in pottery vessels, designed by people who understood that sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from dramatic breakthroughs, but from patient observation and practical problem-solving. They couldn't have known that their solution to the problem of spoiled milk would one day feed Roman legions, sustain medieval monasteries, and inspire modern artisans working in climate-controlled caves. They were simply trying to make the most of the resources they had in the ancient human tradition of transforming challenge into opportunity. The next time you see cheesy cheese, from the simplest cottage cheese to the most complex aged variety, remember those Polish potters working 7,500 years ago with nothing but their hands, their animals, and their determination to find a way forward. They gave us more than just a preservation technique. They gave us proof that human ingenuity, applied patiently and persistently to the problems of daily life, can create something that endures far beyond its original purpose and reaches far beyond its humble origins. The knowledge preserved in those perforated bowls would spread slowly across the ancient world, carried by traders, migrants, and nomadic herders. It would be refined and perfected by countless generations of cheesemakers, each adding their own innovations to the basic process. I remember the weight of those pottery fragments in the archaeologist's hands, how the perforated ceramic felt rough against her fingertips, as she turned each piece slowly in the Polish sunlight. For decades, these mysterious vessels had puzzled researchers. The holes were too regular to be accidental damage, too purposeful to be decorative. They were clearly tools, but tools for what? The fragments came from a Neolithic site, buried for 7,500 years, in layers of earth that spoke of humanity's earliest experiments with settled life. Back then, in what we now call Poland, small communities were making the transition from hunting and gathering to something entirely newer way of life, built around domesticated animals and cultivated crops. These people had learned to keep sheep, goats, and cattle, creatures that could provide not just meat when slaughtered, but milk while they lived. But there was a problem, one that these ancient people couldn't have understood in the way we do now. Most of them, perhaps nearly all of them, lacked the ability to digest fresh milk. Their bodies, like those of most adult humans throughout history, stopped producing lactase after weaning. This enzyme, essential for breaking down the lactose sugar in milk, simply wasn't available to them in adulthood. Drinking fresh milk would have caused them significant digestive distress, cramping, bloating, diarrhea. It would have been, quite literally, sickening. Yet here they were, keeping dairy animals. The contradiction puzzled researchers for years. Why would these practical, survival-focused people maintain herds of creatures whose primary product they couldn't consume? The answer lay in those mysterious perforated bowls, waiting patiently in museum storage rooms for science to catch up with their secrets. I remember the moment when biochemical analysis finally revealed the truth. Researchers took tiny samples from the porous ceramic and subjected them to the kind of molecular detective work that would have seemed like magic to the Neolithic farmers who made these vessels. They were looking for fatty acid residues, molecular fingerprints left behind by whatever foods had been processed. In these containers, thousands of years ago, what they found was unmistakable. Dairy fat, but with a specific isotopic signature that told a remarkable story. This wasn't evidence of fresh milk consumption. This was something else entirely, evidence of milk that had been transformed, processed, separated. The fatty acids bore the chemical hallmarks of cheese production. Suddenly, those perforated bowls made perfect sense. They were strainers designed to separate the solid curds from the liquid whey in the cheese-making process. The holes were just the right size to let the watery whey drain away while capturing the fat-rich, protein-dense curds that would become cheese. These Neolithic farmers had solved their lactose problem with elegant simplicity. They had learned to transform milk into a form they could digest. The process they discovered was really a kind of biochemical alchemy, though they would never have understood it in those terms. When milk is exposed to certain conditions, city heat, or specific enzymes, the proteins begin to clump together, forming curds. This happens because milk proteins, normally suspended in liquid, lose their stability under these conditions and bind to each other in increasingly large clusters. The liquid that remains, called whey, contains most of the lactose that would have caused digestive problems. In those Polish villages 7.5 millennia ago, the process probably happened much as it does today in traditional cheesemaking. Someone, perhaps a woman, as dairy work was often women's domain, would have poured fresh milk into one of those perforated vessels. She might have added something acidic, like the juice from wild berries, or perhaps she had discovered that milk left to sour naturally would undergo the same transformation. The acid would cause the milk proteins to coagulate, forming small, white lumps suspended in a yellowish liquid. Then came the crucial step, straining. By pouring the mixture through the perforated bowl, she could separate the curds from the whey. The whey would drain away, leaving behind the solid curds that could be pressed together, salted, and stored. What remained was a food that was not only safe for lactose-intolerant adults to eat, but also remarkably nutritious and, most importantly, stable. Unlike fresh milk, which would spoil within hours in warm weather, these cheese curds could last for weeks or even months if properly prepared. This discovery, if we can call it that, though it may have been more accident than intention, was revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond the immediate problem of milk digestion. It represented humanity's entry into what archaeologists call the secondary products revolution, a transformation in how we used domesticated animals. No longer were cattle, sheep, and goats valuable only for their meat, hides, and bones. Now they could provide ongoing sustenance throughout their lives. Milk transformed into cheese, wool for clothing, labor for farming. Animals became partners in survival rather than simply sources of protein. Tonight, as our journey through the long history of cheese draws to its close, I find myself returning to that desert merchant and his leather pouch, to the accidental miracle that set in motion everything we have explored together. The milk that sloshed against the sheep's stomach lining as his camel walked the ancient trade routes has become, through the centuries, something far more complex and profound than he could ever have imagined. I remember the weight of those Polish pottery shards perforated with purposeful holes that spoke of humanity's first systematic approach to dairy preservation. 7,500 years later, we can trace a direct line from those Neolithic innovations to the climate-controlled caves, where modern artisans age wheels that embody the same fundamental principles. Transformation through patience, preservation through controlled decay, sustenance through partnership with invisible microbial communities. The story we have followed is not really about cheese at all, though cheese has been our faithful guide through the maze of human ingenuity. It is about the eternal tension between our desire to control natural processes and our need to work within them. It is about how necessity becomes art, how survival becomes culture, how the simplest transformations, milk into curd, liquid into solid, perishable into permanent, can carry the weight of entire civilizations. Each era we visited redefined what cheese meant to human survival and identity. The Sumerians made it currency, proof that civilization could store and trade value across seasons and distances. The Egyptians made it sacred, worthy of burial alongside pharaohs as sustenance for the eternal journey. The Greeks made it mythology, embodying the tension between divine gift and primitive necessity that would echo through every subsequent chapter of its development. The Romans made cheese systematic, feeding their legions on standardized wheels that carried the taste of home to the edges of the known world. The monks made it transcendent, transforming the practical work of preservation into something approaching spiritual practice. The traditional European cheesemakers made it local, creating products so tied to specific places that they literally could not exist anywhere else on Earth. The industrialists made cheese efficient, trading the chaos and complexity of traditional methods for the reliability and scale that growing populations demanded. The scientists made it safe, eliminating the invisible dangers that had lurked in dairy products since humanity first learned to transform milk. the artisans made it personal again, reclaiming the individual expression and local character that mass production had systematically eliminated. And now, in our own time, we are making cheese global, creating new fusions that honor traditional principles while exploring entirely new territories of flavor and technique. We are discovering that the choice between tradition and innovation, between safety and character, between local authenticity and global accessibility, is not a choice we make once, but one we remake constantly, in countless small decisions that collectively shape the direction of this ancient craft. I remember the seasonal rhythms that governed every traditional cheesemaking community we visited. Spring abundance transformed into summer aging, autumn preparation for winter scarcity. These cycles connected human communities to the larger patterns of the natural world, reminding them that the most profound transformations could not be rushed or forced, but only guided with patience and skill. Modern cheese production has largely transcended these seasonal limitations, creating year-round availability and consistent quality that previous generations could never have achieved. But in gaining this control, we may have lost something essential about our relationship with food, with time, with the natural processes that sustain us. The artisanal revival we explored represents, in part, an attempt to recover this lost connection while retaining the benefits of contemporary knowledge and technology. The microbial communities that make all cheese possible remain as mysterious today as they were to the first cheesemaker who noticed that certain conditions produced better results than others. We can name the bacteria, map their genetic sequences, and manipulate their activity with unprecedented precision. Yet the partnership between human intention and bacterial action still requires the same patience, observation, and willingness to accept variability that characterized traditional cheesemaking. This partnership suggests something profound about humanity's place in the natural world. We are neither passive recipients of nature's bounty nor masters who can control biological processes completely. We are participants in complex relationships that require understanding, respect, and the humility to recognize that our most important collaborators are invisible to the naked eye. The safety question that pasteurization raised and that remains contentious today reflects deeper tensions about risk, control, and the price of progress. Every generation must decide how much uncertainty it is willing to accept in exchange for complexity, authenticity, and connection to traditional ways of life. There are no easy answers to these questions, only ongoing negotiations between competing values and priorities. The global diversity of cheese traditions we explored reveals both the universal nature of certain human needs and the infinite creativity with which different cultures address those needs. From Indian paneer to Mongolian dried curds, from Mexican queso cotija to Japanese squashed innovations. Human communities have consistently discovered that milk could be transformed into more stable, nutritious, and flavorful forms, but the specific solutions reflected local conditions, cultural values, and available resources. This diversity is both cheese's greatest strength and its most vulnerable characteristic. Globalization offers unprecedented opportunities for traditional producers to reach appreciative consumers worldwide, but it also creates pressures towards standardization and homogenization that could eliminate the regional distinctiveness that makes cheese culturally meaningful. The legal frameworks that have developed to protect traditional products' PDO systems, geographical indications, heritage designations represent attempts to preserve this diversity while accommodating global trade. But their success depends on consumers who understand and value the differences they protect, who are willing to pay premium prices for authentic products, and who see food choices as cultural and environmental as well as economic decisions. I remember the quiet revolutionaries we met along this journey, the monks who preserved knowledge through dark ages, the women who led the American artisanal revival, the traditional producers who adapted ancient techniques to contemporary markets. None of them sought to overthrow existing systems through dramatic confrontation. Instead, they worked patiently, wheel by wheel, customer by customer, season by season, to demonstrate that alternatives were possible and valuable. Their success suggests that meaningful change in food systems, perhaps in any complex system, happens through accumulated individual choices rather than grand systemic transformations. Every wheel of artisanal cheese represents a small vote for diversity over standardization, for local knowledge over industrial efficiency, for complexity over convenience. But these individual choices take place within larger contexts of policy, economics, and culture that either support or undermine traditional food production. The future of cheese will depend not only on the dedication of individual producers and the preferences of individual consumers, but on whether societies create conditions that allow traditional knowledge to coexist with industrial efficiency. Local adaptation to thrive alongside global integration, the eternal tension between innovation and tradition that has driven cheese evolution throughout. History will undoubtedly continue into the future. New technologies will create new possibilities for controlling and manipulating cheese-making processes. Climate change will force adaptations in traditional production regions. Changing consumer preferences will create demand for products that don't yet exist. Alternative milk sources will challenge assumptions about what cheese can be and where it can come from. But the fundamental questions will remain the same ones that faced the desert merchant when he discovered his transformed milk. How do we work skillfully with processes we cannot completely control? How do we balance human needs with respect for natural systems? How do we create something lasting and nourishing from the most perishable materials? The answers that emerge will reflect the values, priorities, and understanding of each generation. Some will emphasize efficiency and safety above all other considerations. Others will prioritize tradition and local character. The wisest will probably find ways to honor both sets of values, creating systems that are simultaneously innovative and rooted, global and local, efficient and expressive. The history of cheese suggests that such creative synthesis is possible because it has happened repeatedly throughout the past. Roman systematization built on Greek mythology, medieval innovation preserved classical knowledge, industrial efficiency coexisted with artisanal revival. Global distribution enabled local authenticity to reach wider audiences. Each apparent contradiction resolved itself not through the elimination of one side, but through the discovery of new ways to honor both. The future will likely bring similar creative tensions and innovative resolutions, as new generations of cheesemakers find ways to address the challenges and opportunities of their time, while maintaining connection to the ancient partnership between human skill and natural transformation. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is discovering cheese for the first time, perhaps a child tasting their first bite of aged cheddar. perhaps an adult encountering artisanal blue cheese, perhaps a traveler exploring regional specialties far from home. The surprise and delight they experience connects them directly to that desert merchant's wonder at finding solid curds where liquid milk had been. And somewhere else, a cheesemaker is checking wheels in an aging cave, turning and tasting and adjusting conditions with the same patient attention that monastic cheesemakers brought to their sacred cellars. The knowledge they apply has been refined over millennia, but the essential work remains unchanged, guiding natural processes toward desired outcomes while accepting that the final result cannot be completely predetermined. These moments of discovery and creation continue the conversation between human ambition and natural process that began with humanity's first attempts to preserve the abundance of spring for the scarcity of winter. Each wheel of cheese aging in darkness carries forward this ancient dialogue, embodying humanity's endless capacity to transform necessity into beauty, survival into art, simple ingredients into complex expressions of place, culture, and time. The merchant's leather pouch has become the climate-controlled cave. The perforated pottery bowl has evolved into precision stainless steel equipment. The seasonal rhythms of traditional communities have given way to global supply chains that operate year-round. But the essential mystery remains: how human intelligence and microbial life collaborate to create something that nourishes both body and culture, something that connects us simultaneously to our biological needs and our deepest aspirations for meaning, community, and continuity across generations. This is the long memory that cheese carries, not just the techniques and traditions of its production, but the record of humanity's patient negotiation with the natural world, our ongoing experiment in creating culture from the raw materials of survival. It is a conversation that will continue as long as humans seek nourishment, meaning, and connection through the foods they choose to create and consume. The story continues, wheel by wheel, in aging caves and modern factories, at farmers' markets and in supermarket aisles, on restaurant plates and family tables around the world. Each bite connects us to this vast network of relationships between past and present, local and global, tradition and innovation, human intention and a natural process. Sleep well, there are more stories to come.